There's a diner off Route 10 south of Richmond, Virginia, the kind with a steel counter from 1958 and a neon sign that flickers twice before it stays on. And on a Tuesday night around 9 o'clock, a 27-year-old waitress named Faye Holloway was carrying a plate of meatloaf to a man who'd never once in his life been told no. She wasn't the kind of woman you'd notice in a crowd a little heavy, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, dark circles under warm brown eyes from working 2 jobs and visiting a father who didn't recognize her anymore. But she had something you couldn't buy with a black Amex or a bench appointment. She was kind without keeping score. The man at the table was Judge Preston Whitfield, 55. Silver hair, Patek Philippe, 3 bourbons deep. And he looked at Faye the way some men look at people they consider furniture. What happened next took 11 seconds. He lifted the plate she'd just served him and turned it upside down on her head. Gravy ran through her hair, down her temples, down the collar of a white apron she'd ironed at 5 that morning. He said 6 words the whole diner heard. "Eat it off the floor, pig." 18 witnesses in the diner saw it. Most of them looked away, but in the darkest corner of that diner, a man in a black suit didn't look away. He'd been sitting alone over a plate of meatloaf he ordered every year on the same night, for reasons only the dead would understand. He didn't flinch, didn't stand, just turned a platinum ring on his right hand slow, once a wolf engraved in the metal, ruby eyes catching the fluorescent light. If Judge Whitfield had known what that ring meant, he would have crawled out the back door on his hands and knees. If he'd known whose mother had been humiliated the exact same way all those years ago, back when the man in the corner was just a boy protecting her memory, he wouldn't have opened his mouth at all. But that's the thing about powerful men who've never met someone more powerful. They can't imagine such a person exists, especially not in a diner that smells like coffee and old grease on a Tuesday night. The man in the corner set his glass down soft and made a decision that would dismantle a judge's career, expose a corruption ring worth millions, and start a love story nobody, least of all him, ever saw coming. His name was Carmine Valenti, and Faye Holloway, with gravy still dripping down her face, had no idea she'd just become the most protected woman on the eastern seaboard. If you've ever been the person no one noticed until you refused to stay quiet, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear that kindness isn't weakness, and subscribe, because this story's just getting started. To truly understand how this heavy plate of meatloaf ended up on Faye's head, we must go back to earlier that evening, to a quiet hospital room where a fading father sat in total silence, and to a dark parking lot where a daughter allowed herself a brief moment to completely fall apart before wrapping her hands around the steering wheel and clocking in for the night. 3 hours before the plate of meatloaf was dumped over Faye Holloway's head, she was standing in the second-floor hallway of Meadow Creek Nursing Home, 20 minutes by car east of Gus's diner, holding a plastic bag with a clean pair of pajamas and a cup of vanilla pudding she had bought at a convenience store on the way there. 6 o'clock in the evening. The afternoon nurses had just changed shifts. The hallway was thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with the smell of supper drifting from the communal kitchen, the kind of smell Faye had breathed in more than 1,000 times and still had never gotten used to. She pushed open the door to room 214. Walt Holloway lay in bed, his back slightly raised, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, his mouth parted a little, a dry streak of saliva at the left corner of his lips. 58 years old, but he looked 70. 3 years ago, he could still fix the kitchen pipes himself, still call Faye every night to ask whether she'd eaten yet, still laugh when she told him stories about strange customers at the diner. Then the stroke came at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, and Walt Holloway became the man lying in this bed, the man who watched his daughter walk into the room without blinking, without even the faintest spark of recognition. Faye pulled the plastic chair up beside the bed, sat down, and used a wet wipe to clean the corner of his mouth, gently, slowly, the way she did every day. She opened the pudding cup, scooped up a small spoonful, and brought it to his lips, but he didn't swallow. The pudding ran down his chin, and she wiped it away. She tried again. He still didn't swallow. She set the cup down and didn't force it anymore. Then she sang, softly, almost nothing more than a whisper with a melody, "You Are My Sunshine," the song he used to sing to her every night when she was little, when her mother had already gone to bed because the pain wouldn't let her sit up, and Walt would sit on the edge of Faye's bed, stroke her hair, and sing in a deep voice that never quite kept the rhythm but always got every word right. Faye reached the second line, and her voice caught. She stopped, swallowed, then kept singing. Walt didn't react. His eyes stayed on the ceiling, still empty, still blank, still with nothing behind those clouded pupils. She held his hand, the hand that had once been calloused from wrenches and screwdrivers, now soft and pale as paper. She bent down, kissed his forehead, whispered beside his ear, "I love you, Dad," then stood up, folded the old pajamas into the bag, placed the clean ones on the nightstand, checked the water pitcher, pulled the blanket up over his chest, and stepped out of the room. She didn't look back, because she knew that if she did, 2 minutes wouldn't be enough. The nursing home parking lot at 6:20 in the evening was so empty that Faye could hear crickets chirping from the patch of grass along the fence. Her 2007 Honda Civic was parked in the farthest corner, because she always left the spaces near the door for the families of older patients. She opened the car door, got in, and shut it. The check engine light on the dashboard blinked yellow. It had been blinking for 3 months, and she didn't have the money to fix it. She took out her phone, opened the timer app, set it for 2 minutes, and pressed start. Then she cried, not a quiet, sniffling cry. She cried with her whole body, shoulders shaking, hands gripping the steering wheel, her face lowered into the empty space between her arms, the sound breaking out of her throat and being swallowed inside the cramped little car that smelled of the $1 air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror. She cried because her father didn't know who she was. She cried because this month's nursing home bill was $400 higher than last month's, and she didn't know where she was supposed to find it. She cried because she was tired all the way down to the bone, the kind of tired sleep can't cure because she didn't even have time to sleep. Her phone vibrated. The 2 minutes were over. Faye wiped her face with the back of her hand, breathed in, breathed out, checked her eyes in the rearview mirror, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice, then started. She drove out of the parking lot, turned left toward Gus's diner, where her night shift began at 7 o'clock. This was Faye Holloway's routine. Every day, she allowed herself to fall apart for exactly 2 minutes in an old car in the parking lot of a nursing home. Then she wiped her face, started the engine, and went to work. No more than 2 minutes, because if it went any longer, she was afraid she wouldn't be able to stop. And if she couldn't stop, then no one would pay Walt Holloway's nursing home bills. No one would carry plates of meatloaf at Gus's diner on a Tuesday night shift. No one at all. Faye parked the Civic in her usual spot behind the diner, the one beside the dumpster that no one wanted, turned off the engine, sat for 3 more seconds looking at herself in the rearview mirror, making sure there was no trace of those 2 minutes left on her face, then stepped out. The back kitchen door of Gus's diner was heavy and squeaked every time it opened. Gus had said he would oil the hinges since last summer, but he never had. Faye took the white apron from the third hook from the left, the hook she had used for all 4 years she'd worked here, tied the strings behind her back, pulled her hair up high, then stepped through the swinging door into the dining area. 5 minutes to 7. The night shift began. Gus Petrakis was standing behind the counter polishing a glass, or more accurately, holding a glass that was already clean and polishing it one more time because he didn't know what to do with his hands when he wasn't busy. 65 years old, Greek by birth. He had immigrated to Virginia from Thessaloniki at 23 with $400 and his mother's tomato sauce recipe. He opened this diner when he was 30, had never taken more than 2 days off in a row, had never married, and had never said more than 3 sentences in succession, unless someone insulted his sauce. Gus watched Faye step out, glanced at the wall clock, and nodded. That was how Gus said hello. Faye smiled at him. That was how Faye answered. 4 years, every night, the same ritual. The diner at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. 14 customers were scattered among the booths and the counter. Faye swept her eyes around the room and began. Booth 3 was Mr. Phil, 72, a widower, who came every Tuesday and Thursday night and ordered black coffee with 1 slice of apple pie, no whipped cream, because his doctor said his cholesterol was high. Faye brought out his coffee before he even had the chance to ask, and Mr. Phil looked at her with a smile that held sadness in the eyes. The kind of smile old people wear when they eat alone because there is no one left to eat with. Booth 5 was the Henderson couple, both allergic to gluten. Faye had remembered that from the first time they came in 2 years ago, and every time they ordered, she automatically told the kitchen to make the changes, without needing them to remind her. At the counter sat Earl Hobbs, 62, a veteran, a long-haul truck driver, his left arm tattooed with an eagle faded by time, always taking the last seat on the right whenever he stopped in, ordering black coffee with 2 sugars and the large meatloaf plate. Earl didn't say much, but he always nodded thanks when Faye refilled his coffee, and his tip was always exactly 20%. No more and no less, the discipline of a soldier. Faye moved between tables with the kind of instinct 4 years of waitressing had carved into her body, her feet knowing on their own when to move fast and when to slow down, her hands knowing when to pour more coffee without anyone needing to raise a hand and call her over. Around 7:30, she noticed the young mother in booth 7, probably 22 or 23, alone with a little toddler, who was drawing with crayons on the paper tray liner. The mother ordered 1 meatloaf plate for her child and a glass of water for herself. Only water. Faye brought out the food, noticed the mother watching her child eat without taking a bite of anything herself, noticed the young woman's eyes lowering when Faye placed the check on the table, $11.50. You noticed the hand opening a wallet and counting $1 bills one by one before stopping at the 9th. Faye went back to the counter, opened the pocket of her apron, took out the $3 in tips she'd just gotten from booth 3, slipped it into the change tray, brought the check back to booth 7, and said it had already been paid. The young mother looked up, her mouth opening as if to say something, but Faye only smiled and told the 2 of them to have a nice evening, then turned away. Gus saw everything from behind the counter. He shook his head, very slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he knows that saying anything would be useless because Faye would do the exact same thing again tomorrow. He said nothing. A little before 8, the young couple in booth 4, probably around 24 or 25, ordered 2 burgers and a basket of fries. Faye brought them out, set down the plates, and asked if they needed anything else. She turned to leave, then heard the girl say to her boyfriend, not bothering to lower her voice, in the manner of someone who believed waitresses didn't have ears, "When a waitress is that fat, it makes you lose your appetite." The boyfriend laughed. Faye stopped for exactly 1 beat, then kept walking. She didn't turn around. She carried the tray back to the counter, set it down, and tightened both hands around it until her knuckles went white. Gus glanced at her from behind the coffee maker. Faye inhaled, let go, picked up the coffee pot, went back to booth 4, refilled their cups, smiled, and told them to enjoy their meal in a voice you'd never know belonged to someone who had just been insulted, then moved on. She was used to it. So used to it that tears no longer came when she heard things like that. They only settled in her chest, heavy, like a stone she swallowed every day and could never digest. Around 8:15, while she was wiping down the counter, Faye accidentally looked up at the framed photograph hanging on the wall behind the cash register. A black and white picture, old, its corners slightly yellowed. In the photo, Gus was much younger, probably in his 30s, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit, black hair combed back, a sharp angled face, and a very thin smile, as if smiling itself were a concession. Faye had asked about that photo once, 2 years ago. Gus had said only 4 words, then slammed the story shut. A benefactor. He kept this place from burning. Faye didn't ask anything else because she knew Gus, and she knew that once he closed a door, there was no key that could open it again. She looked at the photograph for 1 more second, looked into the man's eyes, then turned back to her work. She didn't know who that man was. She would know, but not tonight. 8 o'clock in the evening. The gravel lot in front of Gus's diner trembled lightly beneath the tires of a glossy black Cadillac Escalade, the kind of car no one in this neighborhood drove, the kind of car people saw on the road and instinctively moved into another lane without knowing why. The vehicle stopped, the lights went out, but the engine kept running for 3 more seconds before falling completely silent. 50 meters away, a black Suburban was parked close to the curb beneath the shadow of an oak tree, with 2 figures sitting inside, their eyes sweeping the parking lot and the front of the diner by habit, without needing anyone to give an order. The rear door of the Escalade opened. The man who stepped out was 1.88 meters tall, lean in the way of a man who didn't eat out of habit rather than out of need, wearing a custom-tailored black suit fitted close to his shoulders, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open by 1 button, just enough to reveal a thin silver chain lying against his skin, but not enough to show the pendant. Black hair, salt and pepper at both temples, clean-shaven face, sharp jawline, and gray eyes that anyone who had ever sat across from him in a closed room would remember for a very long time, not because they were beautiful, but because they held nothing at all, like water frozen over in the middle of January. Carmine Valenti, 36 years old, the third-generation boss of the Valenti family. Tommy Agostino stepped out from the driver's seat, 42 years old, shoulders as broad as a door, a neck thicker than most grown men's thighs, walking exactly one step behind Carmine, never two steps, never beside him. Carmine stopped in front of the diner door, watched the neon sign for Gus's diner flicker twice, before glowing steadily, then pushed the door open and walked in. The bell above the door rang twice. Gus, standing behind the counter, looked up and stared at Carmine for exactly a second and a half, longer than usual, then turned back to polishing a glass. No greeting, no nod, but no sign of surprise either. Only the silent acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough to know there were certain people who changed the air when they walked into a room. Carmine went straight to the last booth against the corner wall, the darkest corner of the diner, where the fluorescent light only reached halfway, and sat down with his back to the wall and his face toward the door. Tommy sat at the counter, 4 stools away from the booth, ordered black coffee, swept his eyes once around the room, then stopped on each entrance and exit for exactly 2 seconds. Faye was refilling Mr. Phil's coffee at booth 3 when she saw the 2 men come in. She had never seen them before. The man in the far corner looked as if he didn't belong in this diner. That suit, that way of sitting, that silence, all of it saying he was used to sitting in places 50 times more expensive than Gus's diner. But Faye was a waitress, and to her, everyone who sat down at a table was a customer, no matter what they wore. She poured a glass of iced tea and brought it to the last booth. Carmine didn't look at the menu. Meatloaf and iced tea. His voice was low, even, using no more words than necessary. Faye wrote it down, nodded, and turned away. Carmine watched her for 2 seconds, then turned back to the wall. Today was September 18th, 23 years earlier. On September 18th, Nina Valenti had died in the second-floor bedroom of the house on the hill outside Baltimore. Heart disease, 4 o'clock in the morning, while Carmine, 13 years old, lay in the room next door and heard his father call his mother's name twice, then fall silent. Every year on this date, Carmine wasn't at the mansion, wasn't at the office, and didn't meet anyone from the 5 families. He drove to Gus's diner, sat alone, ordered meatloaf, drank iced tea, and remembered, because this was the diner his mother used to come to when she had first arrived in America, when she was still a 23-year-old girl from a small village outside Naples, still unaware of who her husband truly was, knowing only that the sauce at Gus's diner tasted almost like the sauce her mother used to make back home, and that was enough to make her feel a little less lost. Carmine remembered his mother every day, but on this date, he remembered her through one specific memory, a memory he never told anyone, not even Tommy. Carmine was 11 years old, a charity fundraiser at Pinehurst Country Club, outside Baltimore. That night, a powerful politician named Douglas Kincaid publicly humiliated Carmine's mother, mocking the homemade lasagna she spent hours cooking and comparing her to livestock in front of a laughing crowd. While his father stood silent for political gain, 11-year-old Carmine found his mother weeping alone behind the kitchen. There, she made him promise never to stand by while a woman was humiliated. Carmine grew up, took power, but his mother's words lived in his bones. 2 years later, she died. Her heart stopped beating at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the doctor called it heart disease. But Carmine knew his mother's heart had stopped beating long before that. Little by little, every time someone looked at her as though she didn't deserve to stand in the room where she was standing. Carmine grew up, took power, became the man the entire East Coast feared, but his mother's words lived in his bones. He despised his father for that night. Despised the way Vittorio chose the port of Baltimore instead of choosing his wife. And he swore, not with words but with the way he lived, that he would never stand still when a woman was humiliated in front of him. Never. The soft clatter of dishes pulled Carmine out of the memory. Faye was walking toward his table, carrying a hot plate of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, thick brown gravy, the exact dish his mother used to order. She set the plate down, and as she did, the back of her hand brushed lightly against his wrist, not on purpose, only because the space between the plate and the table was narrower than she had judged. She looked at him, smiled, and said, "The meatloaf's really good today. I'm confident about that." Her smile imperfect, leaning a little more to the left than the right, shadows under her eyes, but warm. Warm in a way Carmine didn't encounter in anyone in the world he lived in, because in that world people smiled when they needed something, while this girl smiled because there was no reason not to. Carmine looked at her for 2 seconds. 2 seconds longer than usual. Something old stirred behind his gray eyes. Something he couldn't name. Only knew it felt familiar. Familiar like the smell of lasagna with brown cheese. Familiar like concrete steps behind a kitchen. Familiar like the voice of a woman who had once told him never to just stand there and watch. That sense of familiarity had a reason. 3 years earlier, in this very diner, through that same squeaking back kitchen door, but at 2 o'clock in the morning on a November night, rain was pouring so hard the gravel lot had turned into a stream, and the metal awning was rattling like a war drum. Carmine had been 33 then, had held power for 5 years, long enough to know that enemies never attacked when he was at his strongest. They always chose the moment when he was alone. That night, he was alone. A secret meeting with a source from the Port Authority south of Richmond. Tommy waiting in the car 2 blocks away. And the Barbieri family had known ahead of time. 2 shots from the darkness. The first missed. The second tore through his left shoulder, ripped through the deltoid, came out the back, hot blood running down his arm to the tip of his middle finger, dripping in a line onto the wet sidewalk. Carmine fired back twice, not knowing whether he hit anyone, then ran, his left shoulder useless, his right hand gripping the gun, rain slashing across his face, blood mixing with rainwater and spreading across his white shirt in dark pink streaks. He ran 3 blocks, turned into the alley behind a row of abandoned restaurants, saw yellow light spilling from the back door of a small diner, a metal door left slightly open, and slipped inside by survival instinct rather than choice. The kitchen of Gus's diner at 2 o'clock in the morning had only one person in it. Faye Holloway, 24 years old, her hair tied high, her apron streaked with mop water, was dragging a mop across the white tile floor she had just cleaned for the second time, because Gus said the kitchen floor had to be clean enough for him to eat off it. She heard the door, turned around, and saw a blood-soaked man leaning against the doorframe, a gun in his right hand, gray eyes looking at her as if she were an equation without an answer, his breathing heavy, blood dripping from his left arm onto the floor she had just finished mopping. Faye didn't scream, didn't step back, didn't call the police. She looked at the blood on the floor, looked at the blood on his shoulder, then said 2 words in a voice so calm that even she didn't understand why she was able to be calm. "Sit down." Carmine sat. Not because he trusted her, but because his legs couldn't hold him up anymore. She pulled Gus's first aid kit from under the sink, opened it, took out cotton, gauze, and a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. She cut the fabric of his shirt around the wound with kitchen scissors, cleaned it, blood spilling over her hands, and she didn't flinch. She poured peroxide over it. He clenched his jaw but made no sound. She pressed gauze down, wrapped the bandage with a clean dish towel, her hands shaking. Shaking so badly the roll of bandage slipped from her fingers twice. But she didn't stop. She kept wrapping, kept pressing, until the blood stopped seeping through the cloth. He looked at her. "Aren't you scared?" She looked back at him, her hand still holding the gauze in place. "I am. But you're bleeding, and I can't mop the floor when someone is bleeding on the floor I just mopped." Then she stood up, went into the kitchen, took a leftover plate of meatloaf from the evening shift, put it in the microwave, heated it, and brought it out to him with a glass of water. He ate with his right hand, his left hand motionless on his thigh, the gun lying on the table beside the plate, between the fork and the glass of water. And that image, a mafia boss eating a warm plate of the diner's signature meatloaf at 2 o'clock in the morning in the kitchen of a roadside diner with a gun beside his fork, was something no one in the world had ever seen and would never see. When the plate was clean, Carmine stood. He pulled a stack of money from the inside pocket of his suit jacket, $5,000, and placed it on the stainless steel counter. Faye looked at the money, then looked at him, then pushed the stack back toward him with the back of her hand. "I don't take money for this. You were hungry and you were hurt. That's reason enough." Carmine looked at her for 3 more seconds. Didn't ask her name. Didn't say thank you. He picked up the money, put it back in his pocket, then stepped out the back door, into the rain, and disappeared. But he remembered her face, remembered her voice, remembered that sentence. For 3 years, through countless nights when Carmine Valenti couldn't sleep because of the things he had done during the day, the words of the girl who mopped the floor at the meatloaf diner kept coming back. You were hungry and you were hurt. That's reason enough. No one in the world he lived in said things like that. No one gave without asking for something in return. Now, Sitting in the last booth at Gus's diner, Carmine heard her laughing with Mr. Phil at booth 3, that warm voice that didn't have to try, the way she asked the old man how he was feeling today, in a tone that truly wanted to know, not merely to be polite, and he recognized her. It was her, the girl from the rainy night. Carmine didn't call her back, didn't speak. He only cut a piece of meatloaf, put it in his mouth, chewed slowly, and watched. Because Carmine Valenti never acted before he was ready, and tonight he had come here to remember his mother, not anyone else. But memory didn't ask permission. It came when it wanted. 8:45. Carmine had just cut his fourth piece of meatloaf when headlights swept across the diner window, brighter than usual, angled crookedly, the way a car parks when the driver can't be bothered to line it up. A silver Mercedes S-Class slid into the gravel lot, its tires grinding over the stones, stopping diagonally across two spaces and taking up both without making the slightest attempt to correct it. The kind of parking that belonged to someone who believed parking lots existed to serve him, not to be shared. The engine shut off. The lights went out. The driver's door opened first, and a man stepped out, 45 years old, wearing a light gray suit, slightly wrinkled at the elbows, his tie loosened, his face red from liquor, one hand holding a phone while he was still in the middle of speaking. Warren Hale, an attorney, or more precisely, the thing people called an attorney when they needed a polite name for dirty work. Warren walked around to the passenger side and opened the door like a driver. The man who stepped out was half a head taller than Warren, with silver hair slicked back smooth even though it was nearly 9 o'clock at night, a custom-tailored 3-piece charcoal gray suit, a white-faced Patek Philippe on his left wrist, catching the flicker of the neon light, and black Oxford shoes polished so brightly they could reflect the gravel. Judge Preston Whitfield, 55 years old, Richmond County Judge, 22 years on the bench. A name young lawyers in court spoke with a blend of respect and fear, a name poor defendants spoke in a very different voice. The two of them had just come from a fundraising dinner for the county's Judicial Integrity Fund, an irony Whitfield didn't find ironic at all, and 3 bourbons at the event, plus 2 more in the car, had been enough for Whitfield to walk into Gus's diner with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. Warren pushed open the front door. The bell rang twice, and he held the door for Whitfield. Whitfield stepped through without so much as a nod of thanks, sweeping his eyes around the diner with the look people use when they enter a disappointing art museum and want to make sure everyone around them knows they're disappointed. By then, the diner had thinned out from earlier in the evening, with 12 customers scattered around. A middle booth was still occupied, an older married couple halfway through their meatloaf. Warren walked over, bent down, and said something so softly that Faye, standing 3 tables away, couldn't hear it. She only saw the couple look at each other. The husband started to open his mouth, but then he looked into Warren's eyes and stopped. Both of them stood, left money on the table, and quietly moved away. Warren brushed a napkin over the seat, pulled out the bench for Whitfield, and Whitfield sat down in the middle of the diner as if he were taking the presiding chair in a courtroom. Faye watched the older couple leave the diner, looked at the 2 men now seated in that booth, swallowed something bitter in her throat, then took her order pad and walked over. "Good evening. What can I get for you?" Whitfield didn't look at her. He was looking at his phone. Warren ordered 2 bourbons, but the diner didn't have bourbon, only beer and house wine, and Warren sighed as though this were a personal insult. Whitfield finally looked up, and for the first time, he looked at Faye, from head to toe, slowly, the kind of look men use when they aren't assessing a woman, but taking inventory of an object. His eyes stopped at her waist, stopped at her hips, then turned toward Warren as he said loudly enough for Faye and the 3 nearby tables to hear, "Don't they have appearance standards when they hire waitresses here?" Warren laughed, a guttural little laugh from a man who knew he had to laugh when his boss made a joke, even if there was nothing funny about it. Faye stood there, order pad in hand, her thumb pressing so hard against the back of the pen that her nail turned white. She swallowed, kept her face normal, the normal face she had practiced through hundreds of moments when people spoke to her that way, through hundreds of pairs of eyes looking at her body and deciding she wasn't qualified to be treated like a human being. "Here's the menu. Today's special is meatloaf." Whitfield glanced at the menu for 3 seconds, then pushed it away. "Steak. Medium rare." "Yes, sir. We don't have steak. We only have meatloaf, burgers, and chicken sandwiches." Whitfield looked at her as if she had just spoken a foreign language. A diner without steak. Fascinating. He turned to Warren. This place still exists because of mercy. I should have signed the demolition order a long time ago." Warren nodded repeatedly and took out his phone to type something. Perhaps real, perhaps not, but enough to make Whitfield's sentence sound more like a threat than a complaint. Faye didn't know what it meant, but Gus, standing behind the counter, did. He heard every word clearly. The hand he was using to polish a glass stopped for exactly 1 beat, then continued, slower than before. Whitfield was presiding over the eminent domain case in the South Richmond area, a commercial redevelopment project worth tens of millions of dollars, and Gus's diner stood in the middle of 4 lots inside the planned zone. Whitfield hadn't stopped by the diner tonight by coincidence. He had come because this was territory he was about to sign into rubble. And there are certain kinds of men who enjoy strolling through ruins before the ruins know they are about to become ruins. Faye wrote down the order, 2 plates of meatloaf, 2 house beers, and turned away. At the counter, Tommy Agostino set his coffee cup down, leaned slightly toward the last booth, his voice low enough for only one man to hear. "Boss, who's that bastard?" Carmine didn't look up from his plate. "County Judge, Preston Whitfield." Tommy looked at Whitfield, looked at Warren, calculating by the instinct of 14 years as an underboss. "You want me to handle it?" "Not yet." 1 word. Tommy sat back and drank his coffee, but his right hand left the cup and settled on his thigh, closer to the thing he had tucked behind his back beneath his suit jacket. Carmine cut the next piece of meatloaf, but didn't put it in his mouth. He watched Whitfield through the dark space between the 2 booths, watched the way the man sat in the center of the diner as if seated on a throne, watched the way he had looked Faye from head to toe, and then laughed with his accomplice. And inside Carmine's chest, in the deep place where his mother's words had lived since his boyhood, something began to heat. He recognized that same smile in Whitfield, that same tilt of the head, that same way of looking down at women as if they were animals and not bothering to hide it, because he believed he stood so high that no one would dare call it what it was. Douglas Kincaid had laughed exactly like that at the country club all those years ago when he called Carmine's mother a cow, and Carmine's father had stood still. Carmine set down his fork, slowly, then lifted his iced tea and took a long drink, his eyes never leaving Whitfield. He didn't yet know what Whitfield would do in the next 45 minutes, but he knew one thing. If that man did anything even close to what Kincaid had done, then this time, no one would stand still. Faye carried the 2 plates of meatloaf out from the kitchen, mashed potatoes on the left, green beans on the right, brown gravy poured just enough, exactly the way Gus had taught her on her very first day. She set 1 plate in front of Whitfield, set the other in front of Warren, and asked whether the 2 gentlemen needed anything else. Whitfield didn't answer. He cut off a piece of meatloaf, put it in his mouth, chewed 3 times, then spat it into a napkin. Not discreetly. He spat it out for the whole diner to see. He pushed the plate toward Faye, his face twisted as if he had just tasted something pulled from a garbage can. Food cooked by a pig smells like pig. Warren laughed, the rehearsed kind of laugh, timed exactly for the moment his boss needed laughter underneath him. Faye stood beside the table, both hands gripping the tray, her fingers white. She didn't answer. 4 years of serving tables had taught her that sometimes silence wasn't cowardice but survival, and this was one of those times. She nodded slightly and asked whether he would like something else instead, her voice so even that even she was surprised she could hold it steady. Whitfield didn't answer the question. He lifted his beer, took a long drink, then set the glass down crookedly at the edge of the table, deliberately, and when Faye reached out to push it in for safety, Whitfield knocked her wrist away. The beer tipped over. It spread across the Formica tabletop, ran to the edge, and dripped onto Whitfield's lap. He looked at the beer stain on his suit pants, then looked at Faye with the expression people use when looking at a dog that has just urinated on the rug. "You spilled beer on me. Sir, you just knocked. You spilled beer on me. Clean it up." Faye looked at him for 2 seconds. Then she took a towel and wiped the table. She didn't wipe him. She wiped the table, wiped the seat, wiped the floor beneath his feet. Whitfield watched her kneel to clean the floor, and something lit up in his eyes, a murky kind of light that power addicts get when they find someone willing to bend down. Faye stood, stuffed the dirty towel into the pocket of her apron, and turned away. She had taken exactly 2 steps when Whitfield's hand caught the apron strings behind her back and yanked her backward. She jerked back, nearly losing her balance, her shoulder striking the edge of the table beside her. "I didn't give you permission to leave." Whitfield's voice was lower now, slower. the kind of voice he used in court when he wanted a defendant to understand that he owned the next 10 minutes of their life. "Stand here. Let me look." Warren pulled out his phone, pretending to check his schedule while smirking, treating the humiliation of a helpless woman as nothing more than late-night entertainment after a fundraising dinner. Faye stood beside the table, the apron string still in Whitfield's hand, and for 1 second she wasn't a waitress anymore, but an animal held by a leash, made to stand there for someone to stare at. She looked down at his hand on her apron string, then lifted her eyes to his, and said, not loudly but clearly, "Please let go." Whitfield didn't let go. He tilted his head and smiled, the smile of someone who had just heard a parrot speak human words, interesting but changing nothing. Faye yanked her apron free, hard. The string slipped from Whitfield's hand. She stepped back, her face red, not from shame but from something hotter than shame rising up her throat, but she swallowed it down because she didn't have the privilege of anger. She had a nursing home bill to pay. She needed this job, and anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. Heavy footsteps came from the kitchen. Gus Petrakis pushed through the swinging door, a hand towel draped over his shoulder, his eyes reading the entire situation in 1 second, because Gus had lived long enough to know when something ugly was happening inside a room. He walked to the middle booth, stood beside Faye, and spoke in a low, rough voice. "Is there a problem here?" Warren didn't stand, but he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a business card, placed it on the table, and turned it so Gus could read it. Embossed letters on ivory paper. "Preston Whitfield, County Judge, Richmond Court." Warren spoke gently, the way threats are always gentle when the speaker knows he has the knife by the handle. "Do you want your business license reviewed?" Gus looked at the business card, looked at Whitfield, looked at Warren, then looked at Faye. In the eyes of that 65-year-old Greek man, Faye saw all the things she would never forget. Outrage, helplessness, and shame. Shame, because he knew he wouldn't do anything. Because he had kept this diner alive for 40 years by knowing when to bow his head and when to stand straight. And tonight, with a judge's business card on the table, and the eminent domain order hanging over him, he knew he had to bow. Gus gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, then turned back toward the kitchen. The swinging door closed behind him. Faye watched him go, and she understood. She understood because she was bowing too. At the counter, Earl Hobbs sat on the last stool to the right, gripping his coffee cup so hard the porcelain crackled. 62 years old, a veteran, 2 tours in Iraq, a man who had once lain under mortar fire without his hands shaking, but now his hands trembled. He wanted to stand, wanted to walk to the middle booth and tell Whitfield he had no right to touch that girl. But Warren turned his head and looked at him, only looked, said nothing, but that look was clear enough. "You have something to lose too, Earl. Everybody does." Earl looked down at his coffee cup. He didn't stand. Behind the kitchen door, in the narrow gap between the hinge and the frame, Cody Marsh, 17 years old, busboy, curly-haired, acne scattered across his face, working his first night shift of the week, stood with a tray of dirty dishes in his hands, and his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had seen everything through the crack in the door, saw Whitfield spit out the food, saw him knock over the beer, saw him grab Faye's apron. He set the tray down on the floor as softly as he could, pulled his phone from the back pocket of his jeans, his hands shaking so badly he had to hold it with both hands, opened the camera, and pressed record. No one saw him. He stood behind the door, the phone raised at chest level, and recorded. Because his grandmother had once told him, his grandmother back in Roanoke, a 73-year-old woman who had never set foot in a courtroom but understood justice better than any judge. "Cody, if you see something evil, make sure other people get to see it too." He recorded. His hands shook, but the phone stayed steady. In the last booth, in the shadows, Carmine Valenti set his fork down beside the half-eaten plate of meatloaf, slowly, without a sound. His gray eyes were fixed on Whitfield, and something inside those eyes was changing state, moving from observation into something else, something Tommy Agostino recognized immediately from where he sat at the counter, because he had seen it before. The last time Tommy had seen that expression on Carmine's face was 18 months earlier, in a warehouse in Baltimore. And the 3 men in that warehouse did not live through that night. Tommy leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for one pair of ears, "Boss." Carmine didn't turn his head, didn't look at Tommy. His eyes remained fixed on Whitfield. And he said one word, so soft it was almost not language, but breath given shape. Quiet. The plate hit Faye's head, flipped upside down, and everything in the diner stopped as if someone had just pulled the plug out of time. Brown gravy ran through her hair, over her forehead, along her temple, following the curve of her cheek down to her chin, dripping onto the white apron she had ironed at 5 o'clock that morning. Mashed potatoes clung to her left shoulder. A piece of green bean slid from the top of her head and came to rest on her collar, and Whitfield sat there, his hand still raised halfway, the empty plate in his grip, laughing with his teeth, the kind of laugh a man makes when he has just done what he believes is the funniest thing of his life. Eat from the floor, pig. 18 people in the diner heard every word clearly, and 18 people reacted in 18 different ways. But not one of those ways was enough. In booth 2, the same little child whom Faye had seen drawing with crayons earlier that evening began to cry, not because she understood what was happening, but because a child's instinct knows when the air in a room has turned wrong. Her mother pulled her into her lap with one hand, while the other lifted the plastic menu up to shield the child's eyes, as if a menu could block out something the child had already seen. In booth 6, 2 old men sat across from each other, both past 70, both lowering their faces toward their coffee cups, as though the answer to the question, "Should I do something?" might be waiting at the bottom, but the bottom of the cup held only coffee grounds and the silence of men who had lived long enough to know that silence was safer than speaking, and knowing that didn't make it any easier to accept. Behind the kitchen door, Cody Marsh stood in the narrow gap, tears running down his cheeks, over his acne, down to his chin, but both his hands held the phone at chest level, and the phone kept recording, kept capturing everything, because hands could shake and eyes could cry, but the record button had already been pressed, and he wouldn't turn it off. In the kitchen, Gus Petrakis stood beside the stainless steel prep table, his right hand gripping the 12-inch kitchen knife he used to slice meat every day, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white, and the tendons in his wrist rose sharply beneath the skin. His eyes stared through the round glass window in the swinging door into the dining room, watching Faye standing there with gravy on her head, and his whole body wanted to go out there. 4 decades of keeping this diner alive, 4 decades of seeing Faye as the daughter he never had. But he didn't step out, because the judge's business card was still lying on the middle booth table, and the eminent domain order hung over this diner like a blade suspended by a thread, and if he walked out with that knife in his hand, Gus wouldn't be the only one to lose the diner. Faye would lose her job too, and he knew Faye needed this job more than he needed his self-respect right now, so he stood there, holding the knife, and didn't step out. At the counter, Earl Hobbs shot up from his stool. His legs shoved the bar stool backward, its feet scraping across the floor with a sharp squeal, his 62-year-old body still as rigid as it had been in Fallujah, reacting before his brain could give the order. He stood straight, turned toward the middle booth, his mouth already open, the first sentence already on the tip of his tongue. But Warren Hale turned his head, looked at him, said nothing, only looked, with the eyes of a professional at staring people down and making them understand that whatever they did next would carry consequences they didn't want to bear. Earl looked back at Warren, looked at Whitfield, looked at Faye. Then he sat down, slowly, the bar stool dragged back into place. His hand gripped the edge of the counter, and he bowed his head, and somewhere inside the chest of that 62-year-old veteran, something broke that he knew would never heal. And Faye stood there, gravy running from her hair down her face, from her face down her neck, from her neck soaking into the fabric of her apron. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't run into the kitchen. She stood there, and she did something no one in the diner expected. She lifted her right hand, slowly, as if she were doing this in front of a mirror every morning and not in front of 18 people watching, and wiped a line of gravy from her forehead down her cheek. Just one line. Slow. Deliberate. Then she lowered her hand, looked at the gravy on her fingers, then looked up, straight into Preston Whitfield's eyes, and her eyes in that moment weren't the eyes of a humiliated waitress, but the eyes of a woman who had endured enough, not just tonight but all her life. From every time she had been called fat, from every time she had been looked at like an object, from every night she had cried for 2 minutes in her car in the nursing home parking lot, from the old wound of losing her mother in her youth, down to the recent heartbreak of a father whose gaze was now empty. From everything, all of it gathering inside those warm brown eyes as they stared directly into the cold gray eyes of a judge, and she said, "You poured food over my head. in front of the whole diner. "Are you happy now? Because I'm still standing here, and you're still the man who just did that." The diner went silent, so silent that the country station could still be heard playing some sad song no one had listened to since the moment Whitfield walked in, so silent that the faint vibration of the refrigerator behind the counter could be heard. Whitfield looked at her. The smile on his face went out, not because of remorse, but because of surprise, because in 22 years on the judge's bench, not one defendant, not one attorney, not one colleague had ever looked him in the eye and spoken to him that plainly, much less a waitress with gravy in her hair in a suburban meatloaf diner. His face went pale for exactly 1 second, one single second in which something almost like shame flickered behind his eyes, then vanished, and what replaced it was 10 times worse. Anger, the kind of anger that belongs to a man who can't bear it when someone beneath him dares to answer back. The kind of anger Faye saw in his eyes and knew meant the night wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the last booth, in the darkness, Carmine Valenti didn't stand. He sat there, his back against the wall, gray eyes staring through the dim space between the booths, looking at the gravy in Faye's hair, looking at the broken plate on the floor, looking at Whitfield as his face began to redden with rage. And he nodded, lightly, almost invisibly. But Tommy saw it. Tommy always saw it. He pulled his phone from the pocket of his suit jacket, angled it slightly toward the middle booth, and pressed record. No one needed to tell him what to record. 14 years as an underboss had taught Tommy that when the boss nodded at a moment like this, it meant gather weapons. Not guns, not knives. Something more dangerous. Evidence. It wasn't time to act yet. Carmine knew that. He knew Whitfield wasn't finished. Men like Whitfield never stop when someone answers back. They only dig deeper. And Carmine wanted him to dig. Dig until there was no way left to climb out. Whitfield didn't stop. Exactly as Carmine knew he wouldn't. He looked at Faye standing there with gravy in her hair, standing there after saying what no waitress should ever say to a county judge. And instead of seeing courage, he saw insult. The kind of insult men like Whitfield feel when the world fails to operate according to the hierarchy they believe is the natural order of things. He stood up, slowly, smoothing the loosened knot of his tie, looking down at Faye, his voice no longer mocking but cold, courtroom cold. "Do you know who I am? Do you know one word from me can shut this rotten little place down before the end of the week?" Faye didn't answer. Not because she was afraid, because she had used up every word she had on the sentence before, and now all she had left was silence. And her silence in that moment was braver than anything else she could have said. Whitfield turned to Warren. "Write it down. This place. The owner's name. Write all of it down." Warren pulled out his phone, nodded, typed something, then looked around the diner, looked at Gus standing behind the round glass window in the kitchen door, and said loudly enough for Gus to hear through the door, "This place will be closed before the end of the month. I promise you that." That sentence traveled through the air, through the swinging door, into Gus's ears, into the ears of the 12 customers still there, into Earl Hobbs's ears as he sat with his head bowed at the counter, into Cody Marsh's ears as he trembled behind the crack in the door, into the ears of the young mother holding her child in booth 2, and into Carmine Valenti's ears in the last booth, and that was the sentence. Not the plate of meatloaf, not the word pig, not the gravy in Faye's hair. It was that sentence. This place will be closed before the end of the month. Because this was the diner where Carmine's mother had once sat. This was the diner Carmine's father had once protected. The photograph of Vittorio shaking Gus's hand still hung on the wall behind the counter, and the drunken man in the gray suit had just declared that he would flatten it. Carmine stood up, the only time that night, not quickly, not loudly, so slowly that Tommy, who had watched Carmine rise from a chair hundreds of times in 14 years, knew this was the most dangerous speed of all, because when Carmine moved fast, it meant he was reacting, but when Carmine moved slowly, it meant he had already decided. Carmine stepped out of the booth. His black leather shoes tapped against the linoleum floor, one step at a time, steady, ringing, clear, because the whole diner had gone so quiet that the country music coming from the small radio above the cash register suddenly sounded sharp and distinct, some singer's voice singing about loss and highways. While Carmine's shoes beat time across the floor like a countdown no one knew the ending to. Past booth 6, past booth 5, past booth 4. Tommy rose from the counter and followed him, exactly 2 steps behind, no more, never beside him. his shadow 1.5 times larger than Carmine's on the floor, but always behind. Carmine stopped beside the middle booth. Beside Whitfield. Beside Faye. But he didn't look at Whitfield. He looked at Faye, looked at the gravy in her hair, looked at the green bean still resting on her collar, looked at the warm brown eyes staring back at him with something between exhaustion and surprise, and he did something Tommy didn't expect. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out his pocket square, black silk, folded into a neat square, and handed it to her. No words, just handed it over. Faye looked at the handkerchief, looked at the hand offering it, looked up at the man's face, and those gray eyes, the eyes she had seen once 3 years earlier, at 2 o'clock in the morning in this diner's kitchen, when he sat eating meatloaf with one hand and a gun beside his fork. Those eyes looked at her now, and she recognized them. Not clearly. Not with certainty. Only dimly, distantly, like trying to remember a dream right after waking up, but enough for her hand to tremble when she took the silk handkerchief. Carmine waited until she had taken it. Then he turned to Whitfield. Slowly. The kind of turn made by a man who had no need to hurry, because everything had belonged to him before it even began. He looked at Whitfield, and when he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper, so low that Warren had to lean in to hear it, but that whisper cut through the air sharper than any shout could have. You just poured food over her head. Whitfield looked at Carmine, looked at the black suit, looked at the way this man stood, straight, not leaning, not crossing his arms, both hands resting at his sides but not relaxed, every finger in its place. And Whitfield didn't recognize any of those signals, because he had never been in a room with this kind of man before. Whitfield puffed out his chest and lifted his chin, the reflex of someone used to sitting above others when challenged. Who are you? This is my private matter. Get lost. Carmine didn't answer with words. He placed his right hand on the Formica tabletop, slowly, deliberately, and left it there, beneath the cheap fluorescent light, letting the platinum ring on his ring finger sit between the puddle of beer not yet wiped away and the gravy-stained napkin. And under that light, the ring gleamed, a wolf engraved into the metal, with 2 ruby eyes smaller than pinheads but so red beneath the fluorescence that they looked as if they were staring back at whoever looked at them. Warren Hale saw it first. He was holding his phone, ready to type the diner's name into his notes, and his eyes slid across the ring, slid across the wolf, then stopped. He knew that ring, not because he belonged to the underworld, but because he had lived on the lower floors of Richmond's legal system long enough to hear stories, long enough to know there were names the police didn't say after hours, long enough to know there were rings that, once seen, meant the only thing to do was stand up and walk out the door without looking back. Warren's face changed color, from red with liquor to gray in 2 seconds, so fast it looked as if a light had been switched off beneath his skin. He grabbed Whitfield's arm, leaned close to his ear, whispered something urgently, but Whitfield brushed his hand away, still drunk, still arrogant, still convinced that the business card of a county judge was a shield against everything in the world. The diner bell rang. Twice. The door opened. 2 men stepped inside. Black suits, broad shoulders, expressionless faces, moving without the sound of footsteps, and split apart to stand on either side of the entrance. 1 man on each side, hands clasped in front of their stomachs, eyes sweeping the room once before going still. No one in the diner knew where they had come from, but everyone understood that the only door out of the diner had just been blocked by 2 walls made of flesh. Whitfield looked at the 2 bodyguards, looked back at the ring on the table, looked at Warren, and for the first time saw Warren's face gone white, and he began to understand, slowly, layer by layer, like a man sinking into cold water, that the man standing in front of him was not a passing customer, not some businessman trying to play hero for a woman, but something Whitfield had never encountered in his life, because he had lived inside his bubble of power and had never had to look up. The blood drained from Whitfield's face, not gradually, but fast, visibly, from forehead to cheek to throat, as if someone had opened a valve beneath his chin and let it all out. Carmine looked at him, and for the first time that night, he spoke more than 1 sentence, his voice still a whisper, still low, but every word clear as if carved into stone. My name is Carmine Valenti. You can Google that name after you leave here, if you still get to leave. Then Carmine turned to Faye, and his voice changed. Completely changed, from steel into something Tommy Agostino, standing 2 steps behind him, recognized instantly as something he had never once heard the boss use in 14 years. Never, with anyone. That voice was lighter, slower, almost gentle, and it sent a chill down Tommy's spine, because he knew that when Carmine Valenti was gentle with someone, it meant he had decided that person mattered, and when Carmine decided someone mattered, the world around that person changed whether they wanted it to or not. "Are you hurt?" Faye looked at him, the black silk handkerchief in her hand, gravy still in her hair, warm brown eyes looking into cold gray ones, and she answered in a tired voice, tired all the way down to the bone, the voice of someone who had endured enough and wanted only one thing. "I'm fine. I just want to finish my shift and go home." Carmine didn't wait for Whitfield to answer what he had said before. He didn't need the man to answer. He needed the man to hear. "You're going to kneel, and you're going to apologize to her." Carmine's voice wasn't any louder than it had been a moment earlier, still a whisper, still low, but the shape of the sentence had changed. It was no longer an observation, it was an order, and in the world Carmine lived in, his orders didn't come with the part that said, "Only if you want to." Whitfield looked at him, looked at the two bodyguards standing on either side of the door, looked at Tommy standing behind him like a wall that knew how to breathe. Then he did what people accustomed to power always do when cornered. He chose title over reality. "I am the Richmond County Judge. I don't kneel before anyone." He said it in his courtroom voice, the voice he had used for 22 years to make other people shut their mouths. But here, in a suburban meatloaf diner with gravy spread across the linoleum floor and two bodyguards blocking the door, that courtroom voice sounded as out of place as a piano in a scrapyard. Tommy didn't need an order from Carmine. 14 years walking behind the boss had taught him when to step forward without waiting for a nod. He moved up, stood beside Whitfield, and placed one hand on the man's right shoulder. He didn't grab, didn't squeeze, only placed it there. But Tommy Agostino's hand carried a different kind of weight. The weight of 120 kilograms of muscle and 14 years of professional violence compressed into 5 fingers, and Whitfield felt that weight through the fabric of his 3-piece charcoal gray suit, through the shoulder bone, all the way into his spine. And he understood that this hand might be resting lightly now, but it could also choose not to, and he didn't want to know what not lightly looked like. Warren Hale, attorney, errand man, the man who 10 minutes earlier had still been presenting a business card and threatening Gus's operating license, had already backed away from the booth. 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps, until his back touched the counter. He stood there, eyes on the floor, hands hanging at his sides, and said nothing. He abandoned Whitfield completely, fast and clean, as if 10 years of serving him had never existed, because Warren Hale was the kind of man who was loyal only when loyalty was profitable, and right now, the only profit left for him was becoming invisible. Whitfield watched Warren retreat, watched Tommy standing beside him, watched Carmine standing in front of him, and he understood, slowly, painfully, that he was standing alone. For the first time in 22 years, there was no system holding him up, no court, no business card, no lawyer, nothing at all. Only him and a linoleum floor sticky with gravy. Whitfield's knees touched the floor. They touched the very puddle of gravy he had poured from the plate of meatloaf onto Faye's head, the brown sauce now cold and tacky, soaking through the fabric of his suit pants, and he knelt in it, in the very thing he had created, in front of 12 customers, in front of Gus, standing behind the round glass window of the kitchen door, in front of Earl Hobbs at the counter, in front of Cody Marsh behind the crack in the door still holding up his phone and recording, and in front of Faye Holloway, the 27-year-old waitress with gravy in her hair whom he had called a pig 15 minutes earlier. "I'm sorry." 2 words, forced out of Whitfield's throat like water wrung from a dry rag. He didn't look at Faye. He looked at the floor. It wasn't a voice of remorse. It was a voice of submission. There was a difference, and everyone in the diner heard it. Faye looked down at him, a 55-year-old man, silver hair shining, Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, kneeling on a gravy-stained linoleum floor in a suburban meatloaf diner, while she stood above him, not because she wanted to stand above anyone, but because he had chosen to put himself beneath her. She stayed silent, for a long time, long enough for the country song on the radio to finish one chorus and begin the next. Then she spoke, her voice light, no longer shaking, light in the way only someone who has endured all the way to the end can be light. "I accept your apology. Not for you, but for me. I don't want to carry this anger home with me tonight." Carmine stood 1 step away from her. He heard that sentence, heard every word, and somewhere inside his chest, behind the ribs, behind the layer of steel, that 23 years without a mother, and 8 years, as Boss had forged around him. Something cracked. It didn't break, it only cracked. A tiny fracture, thin as a strand of hair, but wide enough for something to slip through. Something Carmine didn't recognize because he hadn't felt it in far too long. She could have cursed him, could have slapped him, could have cried, could have demanded compensation. Carmine would have understood any of those reactions. But she chose forgiveness. Not for Whitfield, but for herself. And Carmine couldn't understand that response. It existed outside the frame of reference he lived by. Because in his world, when someone insulted you, that person paid for it. No exceptions, no forgiveness, only the bill and the interest. And yet this girl stood here with gravy in her hair and forgave. Carmine nodded to Tommy. Tommy understood. He took Whitfield by the arm and pulled him to his feet. Not gently, but not roughly either. Just enough to let Whitfield know that from this point on, he would move in the direction Tommy wanted, not the direction he chose. Warren was already standing at the door, gray-faced, eyes on the floor. Tommy pushed Whitfield toward the exit, past the 2 bodyguards still standing on either side like stone columns, and out into the gravel lot. Warren followed, nearly tripping over the threshold, stumbling across the stones, and the sound of gravel under his shoes sounded more desperate than any gravel Faye had ever heard. The door closed, the bell rang twice. The 2 bodyguards turned and followed them out. Inside the diner remained Carmine, Tommy, and 12 customers, slowly remembering how to breathe. Carmine didn't return to the last booth. He walked to the counter and sat on the stool beside the place where Earl Hobbs had been sitting. Earl had already stood and stepped back toward the nearest booth, because instinct told him to give up the seat. Carmine said to Faye, his voice normal again. Not whispering, not gentle, just normal. "Get me a cup of coffee." Faye looked at him, still standing beside the middle booth, the gravy beginning to dry in her hair. Then she nodded, walked behind the counter, poured the coffee, and set it in front of him. Her hand was still shaking. Carmine took a sip, then looked up at the wall behind the cash register. The black and white photograph. Gus, 30 years younger, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit, black hair, thin smile. Carmine looked at the photograph for a long time. Longer than a person looks at a strange picture. Long in the way someone looks at the face of someone he knows. Gus stood behind the counter, having stepped out from the kitchen at some point no one noticed, watching Carmine look at the photograph. And the 65-year-old Greek man suddenly saw something in the lines of the younger man's face before him. The line of the jaw, the way the eyes narrowed when focused. And he remembered the 10 or maybe 11-year-old boy who had come with Vittorio to the diner 25 years earlier. The boy who sat at the counter drinking soda while his father talked with Gus in the last booth. The boy Gus had given an extra scoop of ice cream for free, because he had said thank you in Italian. Vittorio's son. Gus said, almost whispering, his voice trembling slightly, because he understood that the soda-drinking boy from that day was now the man the entire East Coast feared. Carmine neither confirmed nor denied it. He took another sip of coffee, set the cup down, then spoke in an even voice, his eyes still on the photograph. "No one touches this diner. You understand me?" Gus nodded, slowly, a nod that 40 years of keeping a diner alive in this part of town had taught him the meaning of. Not an empty promise, but a kind of guarantee no court could provide, yet more certain than any ruling. Carmine finished the coffee, placed a $100 bill on the counter, stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. Tommy followed. The bell rang twice. Gravel lot, Escalade, engine starting, red tail lights turning left onto the main road, then disappearing. The diner was silent. Faye stood behind the counter, one hand still holding the black silk handkerchief she hadn't used to wipe anything, the other gripping the edge of the counter. And for the first time that night, she realized she was holding the handkerchief very tightly. So tightly, it was as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling. Faye drove the Civic back to her studio apartment at 11 o'clock at night. She parked in her usual spot along the curb, turned off the engine, and sat for one more minute looking at the yellow light through the second-floor window. The light that meant Bess was still awake, and Bess being awake meant Faye would have to tell her, and telling her meant living through all of it one more time. And Faye wasn't sure she had the strength to live through all of it one more time. She climbed the stairs and opened the door. Bess Miller was sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a reality show playing that no one was watching. 29 years old, a night shift nurse, off tonight, her hair tied up in a scarf, wearing the cat print pajamas she wore whenever she didn't leave the house. Bess looked up when Faye walked in, and Bess's eyes stopped on Faye's hair. Faye's hair was dry now, but the gravy was still there, hardened in clumps on the strands in front of her forehead, dark brown, stiff, with one long streak running from her temple down to her collar, a streak Faye hadn't seen because she hadn't looked in the mirror before leaving the diner. She had only wanted to go. Bess set the tea down. "What is that in your hair?" Faye stood in the middle of the room, her purse still on her shoulder. And she didn't cry, didn't shake, only stood there with the face of someone whose battery had died long ago and who was running on something she couldn't name. She told her. Briefly. Not in order, but in fragments. The judge, the plate of meatloaf, the apron being grabbed, the word pig, the gravy on her head, the man with gray eyes, the ring, kneeling, apologizing. Bess listened, and Bess's face passed through 4 stages in 3 minutes. Surprise, anger, more anger, and anger so fierce she stood up from the sofa. "I'm calling the police. Right now. Then I'm calling a lawyer. Then I'm calling the news." Faye sat down on the edge of the bed, took off her shoes, her feet aching from standing for 6 hours straight. "Sue a judge? With what money, Bess? Am I supposed to hire a lawyer with tips?" Bess opened her mouth to say more. But then she looked at Faye's face and closed it again. Because Bess knew Faye, knew that calm voice wasn't calm at all. It was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that would break if pushed even a little further, and Bess didn't want to be the one who pushed. Faye went into the bathroom and shut the door. The bathroom was small, with a standing shower, weak water pressure because of the old building's pipes, and a plastic floral curtain yellowed along the bottom edge. She took off the apron, took off her shirt, took off her pants, dropped everything into the laundry basket, stepped into the shower, and turned on the hot water. Water ran through her hair, and the gravy began to loosen, brown streaks spreading across the white floor of the tub, flowing toward the drain, carrying with it crumbs of mashed potato, carrying with it a tiny piece of green bean she hadn't known was still caught at her hairline, carrying away every physical piece of evidence from what had happened tonight. But it couldn't carry away the rest. Faye stood beneath the hot water, both hands braced against the cold tile wall, her head lowered, water running over the back of her neck, and she began to cry. Not for 2 minutes the way she cried in the car at the nursing home parking lot. No timer, no limit. She cried with her whole body, shoulders shaking, back curved. The sound of her crying drowned beneath the running water, and still escaping through the crack beneath the bathroom door, and Bess sat outside on the sofa and heard it. And Bess cried too, silently, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her cat print pajamas. Because Bess knew that if Faye Holloway cried for more than 2 minutes, it meant the world had pushed her past a limit that 4 years of waitressing, losing her mother, having a bedridden father, body shaming, paying strangers' checks, and sleeping 4 hours a night had never pushed her past before. Faye cried until the hot water ran out. The water turned from warm to cold, and she still stood there, shivering, but she didn't step out, because the bathroom was the only place where she was allowed not to be strong. Then the cold seeped into her bones, and she turned off the water, wrapped herself in a towel, stepped out, didn't look at Bess, got into bed, pulled the blanket over herself, turned her face to the wall, and slept, or pretended to sleep. Bess didn't ask. The next morning, Faye woke at 5 o'clock as she did every day, ironed a fresh apron, tied up her hair, and got ready to work the morning shift at the bakery. Her phone lay on the nightstand, lighting up again and again through the night. But she hadn't looked at it. Bess had. Bess had sat up at 3 o'clock in the morning because she couldn't sleep, picked up Faye's phone, and saw it. The video. Online. The title. Richmond judge dumps food on waitress's head. Cody Marsh had posted it. Maybe last night. Maybe early that morning. Bess didn't know. But by 3 o'clock in the morning the video already had more than 100,000 views, and by the time Faye woke at 5 o'clock, it had passed 500,000. Bess handed the phone to Faye. Faye looked at the screen, looked at the title, looked at the number, looked at the thumbnail, the image of herself standing beside the booth with gravy in her hair, taken from the kitchen door, Cody's angle. She scrolled down to the comments. The first comments were supportive. "Bastard judge. This girl is so brave. That man should be locked up." Then came the other comments, The kind Faye knew would come because they always came. She really is fat. She deserved it. Look at that face. Probably staged it to get famous and sell stuff online. Who wants to look at someone that big while being served? Faye read until the 12th comment, then stopped. She turned off the phone. Not just the screen, but the power. Holding the button until the screen went completely black, she placed the phone face down on the table, went into the bathroom, brushed her teeth, washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror for 3 seconds, then came back out, put on her coat, and went to the bakery. 6 hours later, she finished her morning shift, drove to the nursing home to visit her father, sat for 20 minutes, sang, kissed his forehead, went out to the parking lot, cried for 2 minutes, wiped her face, and drove to Gus's diner, tied on her apron, put up her hair, started the night shift, like every day, because Faye Holloway didn't know any other way to live except this one. Get up, go to work, serve tables, and pretend the world hadn't just poured a plate of meatloaf over her head and filmed it for 500,000 people to see. When she arrived at the diner, Gus was standing behind the counter, and outside the door 2 reporters were parking their car. Gus looked at her, looked at the reporters, then went to the door, locked the bolt, flipped the sign from open to closed, and called through the glass, "No tables." Then he turned around, flipped the sign back to open, and opened the door for Faye. That was how Gus Petrakis said, "I'm protecting you." Not with words, with a sign and a lock. That same night, while Faye stood under the shower crying until the hot water ran out, Carmine Valenti sat in the study on the 2nd floor of his mansion outside Baltimore, the desk lamp on, the curtains drawn shut, an untouched glass of scotch on the oak desk, and made a call. Frankie Ferraro answered after the 2nd ring because Frankie always answered after the 2nd ring when the boss's number appeared, not sooner, because sooner was flattery, and not later, because later was disrespect. And 63 years serving 2 generations of bosses had taught him things no law school ever could. I want to know everything about Preston Whitfield, Richmond County Judge. Everything. Assets, debts, cases, mistresses, misconduct, who pays him, who he pays. 48 hours. Silence on the line. Frankie processed information the way he always did, quickly and without unnecessary questions, but this time he asked one because he had to ask. The boss is interested in a county judge? Carmine looked at the scotch, looked at the desk lamp's light passing through the amber liquid, and answered with a sentence Frankie would remember for a very long time. "I'm interested in a man who poured food over a woman's head." Frankie went silent, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. He had stood by Vittorio's side for decades, managing the family's deepest secrets, and had been present at that Pinehurst Country Club fundraiser that night, had seen Nina carry the tray of lasagna out of the banquet room, had seen the little boy Carmine run after his mother, and he knew that when the boss talked about men pouring food over women's heads, the boss wasn't talking about Whitfield. The boss was talking about Douglas Kincaid. The boss was talking about that night. The boss was speaking in Nina's voice. 48 hours, boss. I understand. The line went dead. Carmine set the phone down, still hadn't touched the scotch, stood, and walked to the desk on the other side of the room, where a laptop was already open. He sat down and began searching, not through Frankie, not through Tommy, but himself, with his own hands, something he almost never did because a boss didn't dirty his own hands with tasks someone else could handle, but this was something he didn't want anyone else doing. He typed Faye Holloway's name. There wasn't much. No public social media page. Only an old account with a sunflower as the profile picture, and the last post from 3 years earlier, close to the time her father had suffered his stroke. Carmine dug deeper. Through databases normal people couldn't access, but Carmine Valenti wasn't normal people. Faye Holloway, 27 years old. Mother died of cancer when she was 14. Father, Walt Holloway, former mechanic, suffered a severe stroke 3 years earlier. Currently at Meadow Creek Nursing Home, east of Richmond. Faye paid the monthly care bill, $2,800, with wages from 2 jobs, the morning shift at the bakery and the night shift at Gus's diner. She lived in a studio apartment on Maple Street with a roommate, a 2007 Honda Civic, registration about to expire. No credit card debt because she didn't have a credit card. No savings, or if she had any, not enough to renew the car registration. Carmine finished reading, closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and looked at the ceiling. She was the girl from the rainy night, the girl mopping the floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, washing the wound of a blood-soaked stranger, heating meatloaf for him to eat, then pushing $5,000 back because you were hungry and you were hurt. That's reason enough. The girl who paid the young mother's bill with her own tips. The girl who heard people call her fat and still smiled and told them to enjoy their meal. The girl who stood with gravy on her head, looked straight into a judge's eyes, and said, "I'm still standing here." Carmine knew who she was. The question wasn't who she was. The question was what he intended to do with that information. And that question was the dangerous one. Because what did help mean in the way Carmine Valenti understood the word? Send anonymous money? He could. Pay her father's nursing home bills? Easy. Fix her car? One call. But Carmine knew himself well enough to know that wasn't what he wanted to do. What he wanted to do was more dangerous than money, more dangerous than protection, more dangerous than any bullet he had ever fired or dodged. He wanted to be near her, and in the world Carmine lived in, being near someone meant turning that person into a target. Being near someone meant that someday, someone would use that person against him. Being near someone meant weakness, and Carmine Valenti wasn't allowed to be weak. He pushed the chair back, stood, drained the scotch in one swallow, and called Tommy. Warren Hale, Whitfield's lawyer. Pay him a visit. Tommy didn't ask what pay him a visit meant, because Tommy knew. 24 hours later, Tommy arrived at Warren Hale's office in Richmond's administrative district at 10 o'clock at night, while Warren was sitting alone, sorting case files. Tommy walked in, closed the door, sat in the chair across from him, and spoke with Warren for 14 minutes. No one knew what Tommy said during those 14 minutes, except Tommy and Warren. But 48 hours later, Warren Hale closed his office, sold his Richmond condo for 40% below market value, and moved to a small town in North Carolina he had never mentioned before. He wasn't killed, wasn't injured. He was simply persuaded very thoroughly that Richmond was no longer a suitable place for his health. Whitfield lost his errand man without knowing why. He called Warren 12 times. No one answered. The messages went unread. Warren Hale disappeared from Whitfield's life as cleanly as if those 10 years had never existed, and Carmine sat in his study, read the report Tommy sent, nodded, then opened the laptop and checked Cody's video online. 500,000 views, comments growing every hour. Reporters had started digging. The Judicial Commission had begun receiving emails from the public. The video was alive, spreading, eating away at Whitfield's career minute by minute. Carmine could have taken the video down at any time. He had people inside every platform. One call would be enough. But he didn't take it down. He wanted the video to exist, not because of justice. Carmine didn't believe in justice. Justice was something the rich bought and the poor begged for. He wanted the video to exist because it was a weapon. A weapon no one could trace back to him. A weapon public opinion was holding for him while he sat in the dark collecting another kind of weapon. Real evidence. The kind Frankie was digging up from 22 years of Whitfield's misconduct. Carmine sipped the scotch, set the glass down, and looked at the screen. 510,000. 520,000. The number kept rising, and Carmine smiled. For the first time that night, a thin, cold smile. The kind of smile that, if Faye Holloway had seen it, she would have understood that the man who handed her the black silk handkerchief in the Meatloaf Diner that night wasn't a knight, wasn't a hero, wasn't anything she could call good. He was Carmine Valenti. He was calculating, methodical, and cold. And now Whitfield was in his sights. Not because he hated Whitfield, but because Whitfield had touched something Carmine hadn't yet named, but had already decided to protect. 5 days after the night of the meatloaf plate, Faye Holloway was still working 2 shifts, still visiting her father every afternoon, still crying for 2 minutes in her car, still tying on her apron at 7 o'clock every night at Gus's diner, and still pretending 500,000 people hadn't watched the video of food being dumped over her head. The reporters had mostly stopped coming to the diner because Gus flipped the sign to closed every time he saw a camera lens. But Faye's phone was still powered off, and she hadn't turned it back on because she knew what she would see. Tuesday, 11 o'clock at night. The night shift ended. Faye untied her apron, hung it on the 3rd hook from the left, said goodbye to Gus, and stepped out the back door. The parking lot behind the diner was dark. The only light on the wooden pole had burned out last week. Gus had said he would replace it, but hadn't yet, and Faye walked to the Civic by the light spilling from the kitchen through the door. She opened the door, got in, and turned the key. The engine coughed, coughed again, then went silent. She tried again, a second time, a third time. The engine turned over but wouldn't start, the starter dragging long, then weakening, then dying completely. And the check engine light blinked 3 times before it went out too, the whole dashboard going black. The car was dead. Faye sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, looking through the windshield into the darkness. She hit the steering wheel. Once. Twice. The third time was hard enough that the back of her hand stung. Then she lowered her head into the space between her arms on the wheel, her forehead touching the hard plastic, her eyes closed, and breathed. She didn't cry. There were no tears left for this week. She only breathed, and thought that fixing the car would cost at least $300 she didn't have. Thought that she was still $400 short on this month's nursing home bill. Thought that the bakery had just cut her morning shift hours from 6 down to 4 because it was the slow season. Thought that she was 27 years old and tired the way 70-year-old people were tired. The kind of tired where even the bones were tired. Gravel crunched. Headlights swept across the right side window. A large vehicle stopped beside the Civic, its engine still running. Headlights off, but running lights still glowing. Enough for Faye to recognize the shape of the black Escalade. The passenger side window lowered, and that voice, low, even, spare with words, the voice she had heard twice in her life, and both times at moments she least expected. Need a ride? Faye lifted her head and looked through her car window into his. Carmine Valenti sat in the back seat, wearing a black shirt with the collar unbuttoned, his face half lit and half shadowed by the running lights, gray eyes watching her with something she couldn't read because she had never met a man who looked at her that way, not with pity, not with desire, not with curiosity, but with something almost like attention, the kind of attention that had a purpose. She looked at the dead Civic, looked at the dark road, looked at the powered-off phone in her pocket. Then she opened her car door, stepped out, walked around to the Escalade, opened the rear door, and got in. Tommy was in the driver's seat, eyes straight ahead, not turning back, not greeting her, because Tommy knew when the boss wanted privacy, and tonight was one of those times. The car moved. Silence stretched for 2 minutes. Faye looked out the window, watching Richmond Street slide past. Bars, closed storefronts, traffic lights blinking yellow because midnight had already passed. Carmine sat half a meter away from her in the back seat, near enough for her to hear him breathe, far enough that no one touched anyone. Faye spoke first. She didn't look at him. She looked at the window. You made him kneel. That night, there was no need to say a name. They both knew who him meant, and which night she meant. Carmine looked at the back of her neck, at the loose curls near her hairline that had escaped, because they always came loose at the end of a shift, and answered, I should have made him do more than that. Faye turned to look at him. For the first time in the car, brown eyes meeting gray eyes, and she spoke in a voice Carmine hadn't expected, not grateful, not approving, but objecting, gentle and firm as a painted line on the road. No, violence doesn't solve anything. Carmine looked at her. That sentence passed by him like a bullet skimming close to his ear, not hitting, but close enough for him to feel the wind. Violence doesn't solve anything. He had built an entire empire with violence, had kept power with violence, had avenged his father with violence, had survived that rainy night 3 years earlier with violence. And the woman sitting half a meter away from him, the woman who had food poured over her head in front of 18 people, the woman who didn't have money to fix her car, the woman the world had mistreated in every possible way, said violence didn't solve anything. He didn't agree, but he didn't argue, because there was something in her voice when she said it, something that wasn't innocence but choice. She knew violence existed. She had seen him force Whitfield to kneel. She wasn't denying that it worked. She was only refusing it, and that conscious refusal left Carmine silent because he had no answer for this kind of strength, the kind that didn't need a fist. The car stopped in front of the house on Maple Street. The second floor was dark. Bess had gone to her night shift. Faye took hold of the door handle, ready to open it. I'll have someone fix your car. Don't refuse. Faye stopped, her hand still on the handle, and turned to look at him. I don't accept favors from strangers. I'm not a stranger, Carmine said, and his voice changed, softened, the way it had when he asked if she was hurt in the diner. The voice Tommy heard from the driver's seat, making his hands tighten slightly on the wheel, because he knew what that voice meant. The rainy night 3 years ago, 2 o'clock in the morning, Gus's diner's back kitchen door. You bandaged my wound with a clean dish towel. You heated meatloaf for me. I offered you money, and you pushed it back." Faye sat motionless. Her hand on the door handle was no longer gripping it, only resting there, as if she had forgotten what she was touching. "You said, 'I don't take money for this. You were hungry, and you were hurt. That's reason enough.'" Carmine looked at her. "I remember every word." Faye looked at him, and in the gray eyes she had first seen at 2 o'clock in the morning 3 years earlier, when he sat bleeding on the kitchen floor she had just mopped, she saw the very thing she had seen that night, the thing she couldn't name at 24, and still couldn't name at 27. Not gratitude, not coldness, but something in between. Something like a door left slightly open when its owner didn't know it was open. She said nothing. Opened the door, stepped out, walked to the stairs, climbed them, opened the apartment door, went inside, closed it, didn't look back. The Escalade stayed below on the street for 14 more seconds. Tommy counted because Tommy always counted. 14 seconds of Carmine Valenti sitting there, looking at the second-floor door where Faye Holloway had just disappeared. 14 seconds longer than Tommy had ever seen the boss linger for anyone. Then, Carmine tapped lightly on the back of the driver's seat. Tommy drove away. The next morning, when Faye stepped outside at 5 o'clock to go to her morning shift at the bakery, her Honda Civic was gone. In its exact spot sat a reliable, silver sedan with a small, unbranded key tucked under the front windshield wiper. A simple note sat on the dashboard reading, "Your car is at the shop. Use this until it returns." 2 days later, the Civic was back in its old place, idling with a smooth, healthy hum it hadn't possessed in years, its cracked engine block and dying battery completely replaced. No note, no message, no phone number. Faye stood on the sidewalk looking at the car, looking at the key, looking up and down the quiet street at 5 o'clock in the morning. And she knew. She didn't need anyone to confirm it. She took the key, opened the door, got in, and turned the ignition. The engine started on the first try, smooth, steady, with a healthy sound this Civic had never made since the day she bought it for $2,400 from an old man on Craigslist 4 years earlier. She sat in the car, both hands on the wheel, and for the first time in 5 days, she smiled. Small, quick, then gone. But it was there. She drove to work, and on the rear windshield wiper, where she couldn't see it, a drop of dew clung to the new metal, glittered under the streetlight, then slipped down the glass and disappeared. Carmine began coming to Gus's diner more often. Not every night, but often enough that Faye knew when he would appear before the bell above the door rang twice, because she noticed he came on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, always after 8 o'clock at night, always to the last booth, always meatloaf and iced tea, always Tommy at the counter 4 stools away, drinking black coffee while his eyes swept the room. The check each time was $14, the tip each time $500. 5 neatly folded $100 bills tucked under the plate. The first time Faye saw it, she thought he had made a mistake. She carried the money to the last booth, set it in front of him, and said, "You left too much." Carmine looked at her, looked at the money, and said, "It isn't too much." Faye left the money on the table and walked away. The next time, when she found $500 under the plate, she brought it back to him. He wouldn't take it. She put it on the table. He stood up and left without taking it with him. She ran out to the gravel lot, but the Escalade was already rolling away. The time after that, she put the money into an envelope, asked Gus to hold it, and said to return it when Carmine came in. Gus kept the envelope in the cash register drawer. The next night, Carmine came in. Gus handed him the envelope. Carmine took it, opened it, counted it, then set it back on the counter when he stood up to leave, the envelope lying beside Tommy's half-finished coffee. It was a war without gunfire, but both of them were equally stubborn. Faye wouldn't take the money because she had refused $5,000 3 years earlier, and she wasn't going to start accepting it now. Carmine wouldn't stop leaving it, because in his world, when he wanted someone to accept something, they accepted it. But this girl didn't live in his world, and that was both what irritated him and what brought him back every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Affection didn't arrive through words. It arrived through details so small you had to be paying attention to notice them. By the second week, Faye noticed that Carmine drank iced tea, but always squeezed an extra slice of lemon into it, pressing it lightly between his index finger and thumb before dropping it into the glass. So by the third week, she began preparing his iced tea with lemon before he ordered, setting it on the table at the same time as the meatloaf, saying nothing. Carmine looked at the glass of tea, looked at the slice of lemon, looked at Faye as she had already turned away to serve another table, and drank it. Said nothing, but drank every drop. By the 4th week, on the first cold night of autumn, Carmine left the diner but forgot his coat on the back of the booth. Black cashmere, softer than any fabric Faye had ever touched. She folded it and ran out to the gravel lot with it. The Escalade was still there, engine already running, the rear window lowered, and Carmine looked at her standing outside in the cold in her thin apron, holding his coat in her hands, and said, "Keep it, it's cold." Faye looked at him, looked at the coat, then set it on the hood of the Escalade, walked back into the diner, and Tommy, watching in the rearview mirror, saw the $1,200 cashmere coat lying on the dew-damp hood, shook his head, but said nothing because Tommy knew when to shake his head and when to open his mouth. By the 5th week, Carmine began asking questions. Not many, not all at once. Each time Faye came to the table to refill his iced tea, he asked one question. Only one, in a low, ordinary voice, as if asking about the weather. "How is your father?" The next time, "Are you sleeping enough?" The time after that, "Have you eaten anything yet? Or have you only been serving other people food?" Faye stopped at the 3rd question. Stopped in the middle of pouring tea, the pitcher tilted, but no liquid flowing because her hand had gone still. And she looked at him, and for the first time he saw that her eyes weren't the eyes of a waitress looking at a customer, but the eyes of someone who had just been seen, truly seen, not her body, not the gravy that had been in her hair, not the dark circles under her eyes, but the fact that she hadn't eaten, and no one, not Bess, not Gus, not Mr. Phil, no one had asked her that question in a way that truly wanted to know the answer. "Not yet," she said. "It's been busy." Carmine nodded. "Sit down, eat. I'm working. Sit down. 1 minute." Faye looked around the diner, looked at Gus behind the counter, and Gus looked back at her, then looked away as if he hadn't seen anything. And Faye sat down in the last booth across from Carmine Valenti, cut a piece of meatloaf from his plate, put it into her mouth, chewed, swallowed. And she didn't know why that piece of meatloaf tasted better than every piece of meatloaf she had eaten in 4 years at this diner. Maybe because she was hungry, maybe because she was tired, maybe because for the first time someone had told her to sit down instead of her telling someone else to sit down. She ate 3 bites, stood up, went back to work. Carmine looked at the plate of meatloaf missing 3 bites, and drank his iced tea. That night when she went home, Bess was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, her face pale, and she turned the screen so Faye could see. On the screen were Google search results for the name Carmine Valenti, a candid photo from some trial, showing him in a black suit walking down the courthouse steps, his face expressionless, Tommy behind him. An article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. FBI continues investigation into financial network, linked to the Valenti family. Another from the Baltimore Sun, Carmine Valenti, Il Silenzio, and the East Coast Underworld Empire. Another one, older, from 8 years ago. Vittorio Valenti assassinated. Son takes power at age 28. Bess looked at Faye, her eyes wide, her voice pressed low as if she feared the walls had ears. "Faye, you're getting involved with a mafia boss. A mafia boss, Faye. Not some rich businessman. A real one. The kind the FBI has had a file on for 8 years. Faye looked at the screen, looked at the photo of Carmine walking down the courthouse steps, that face, those gray eyes, and she felt something drop in her stomach. Not fear, or not yet fear, but something closer to disappointment, the kind of disappointment that comes when you begin to believe in someone, and then discover the picture you have been looking at has another side you haven't turned over yet. But then she remembered the rainy night, remembered him sitting bleeding on the kitchen floor, eating meatloaf with one hand while the other held a gun, and when she pushed the $5,000 back, he looked at her with eyes she now understood were the eyes of someone being treated like a human being for the first time, without anything demanded in return. She remembered him asking, "Have you eaten yet?" in a voice that truly wanted to know. Remembered the repaired car with no note. Remembered the black silk handkerchief she still kept unwashed in her nightstand drawer. "I know," Faye said to Bess. "Not I know he's mafia, but I know you're going to say that. You have to stay away, right now. Men like that." "I know," Faye said it again, then went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. She knew Bess was right. She knew she had to stay away. She knew Carmine Valenti's world was a world where she had no place, didn't belong, and didn't want to belong. But she also knew something else. Something she didn't tell Bess because saying it out loud would sound insane. The loneliness in those gray eyes pulled her back. Not the danger, not the money, not the power. The loneliness, the kind of loneliness she recognized because she had it too. The kind that belongs to someone walking through a crowd while no one truly sees them. His loneliness was different. Loneliness in closed rooms with power and violence. Hers was different. Loneliness beneath fluorescent lights, with an apron and a tray of dishes. But the shape was the same. At the same time, on the other side of Richmond, in the old Tudor house he had inherited from his father, Preston Whitfield sat in his study with 3 bourbons behind him, his shirt wrinkled. Looking at the result, the police inspector he had known for 20 years had sent him 1 sheet of paper, 1 photograph. The photograph was a surveillance still from the convenience store beside Gus's diner, taken that night, showing the black Escalade in the gravel lot, and the man stepping out. Beneath the photograph, the inspector had written 4 words in red ballpoint pen. Carmine Valenti. Valenti family. Whitfield read it. Read it again. And instead of being afraid, he laughed. Not because he was happy. He laughed because he saw opportunity. Because Whitfield wasn't only a corrupt judge. He was also a link in the Barbieri family's network, the direct rival of the Valentis, and the information he now held in his hand was worth more than any ruling he had ever signed. He picked up the phone and called the number he only called when he had something valuable. The number of Nico Barbieri, 50 years old, boss of the Barbieri family, the man who had paid Whitfield for 12 years to sign eminent domain orders at exactly the right time and in exactly the right place. Nico. Valenti has a weakness. A waitress at a suburban diner. He goes there 3 times a week. He looks at her in a way men like him shouldn't look at anyone. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Barbieri's voice, rough, slow, the voice of a man who never hurried because he had a lifetime to take revenge. What's her name? 11 days after the call between Whitfield and Barbieri. Saturday, close to midnight. Faye locked the kitchen door, her purse on her shoulder, and stepped out into the parking lot behind the diner. Dark. The bulb on the wooden pole still hadn't been replaced. The Civic was parked in the far corner. She had made it halfway across the lot when she heard gravel crunching behind her. Not 1 person, 2 people. Fast steps, purposeful. She didn't have time to turn around before a hand grabbed her hair from behind and yanked her backward, her neck arching, her eyes lifting to the night sky. A man's voice, unfamiliar. Not Richmond, Baltimore. Give your boyfriend a message. Richmond isn't Valenti territory. The second man stood in front of her, arms crossed, smiling. The one holding her hair turned her around and slapped her. Once, a large hand, the back of it striking her left cheekbone, and Faye fell sideways, her knees hitting the gravel first, then both hands, the stones cutting into the skin of her palms, cutting into her knees through her jeans, blood seeping through the fabric. She lay on the gravel, her face burning, her ears ringing, but she didn't scream, didn't cry. She lifted her head, looked straight into the face of the man who had just slapped her, and said in a trembling voice that was still clear with every word, "I'm not anybody's girlfriend. I'm a waitress. You've got the wrong person." The man looked at her, slightly surprised, then laughed and raised his hand to slap her a second time. His hand never touched her face again. Tires ground over gravel. Headlights swept across the parking lot. The black Escalade braked hard 3 meters away, the door opening before the vehicle had fully stopped. Carmine stepped out. Tommy stepped out on the other side. And 2 men Faye didn't know stepped out from the Suburban, parked in the darkness at the far end of the lot. The Suburban she had walked past every night without ever noticing, because that was its purpose, because Carmine had assigned people to protect her from the first week after Meatloaf Night, and she hadn't known a thing about it. The men in the Suburban had been cut off by a sudden, calculated distraction at the entrance of the lot. A minor street scuffle staged by Barbieri's associates to delay them. It took only a matter of minutes for Carmine's men to break through, and for the Escalade to tear into the gravel. But for Faye, lying bruised on the stones, it had been a matter of minutes too long. What happened next unfolded so quickly and so silently that Faye could barely process it. Carmine didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He walked up to the first man, the one who had slapped Faye, and hit him. 1 punch to the jaw, Precise, the angle right, the force right, the kind of strike from a man who had hit many times before and knew exactly how much force was needed to break bone and how much was only needed to hurt. The man fell. Carmine followed, pinned the man's right hand down against the gravel with his foot, twisted, and Faye heard the crack, the sound of bone she would never forget, a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, and the man screamed exactly once before Carmine pressed his face down into the gravel, and he went silent. The second man turned and ran, made it 3 steps before Tommy blocked him, forced him to the ground with one hand on the back of his neck, as easily as holding a dog down against the floor, and the man lay face down on the gravel, gasping. 15 seconds. From the moment the escalade stopped to the moment both men were on the gravel. 15 seconds. Carmine stood over the first man, breathing evenly, not panting, not sweating, then crouched, grabbed the man's hair, pulled his head up off the gravel, leaned close to his ear, and said something Faye couldn't hear. But she saw the man's face, saw the face already twisted with pain from a broken hand, suddenly turn into something else, something beyond pain. And that something was fear, the kind of fear that makes the body lose control and tears fall not from sadness. Carmine let go of his hair, stood, and turned toward Faye. He looked at her. She was still sitting on the gravel, both hands scraped, her knees bleeding through her jeans, her eyes wide, and her eyes were on him, on his hand. His right hand had blood on the knuckles, not his blood. On his face, calm, expressionless, as if he had just cleared a table and not broken a man's hand. And in Faye's warm brown eyes, the eyes that always looked at life with kindness, always searched for the best part in people, something new appeared, something Carmine recognized immediately because he had seen it in the eyes of hundreds of people before her. Fear. Not fear that he would hurt her. She knew he wouldn't. But fear that the dark part of him, the part she had tried not to look at, the part she had tried to believe wasn't as large as people said, was deeper than she had imagined, wider than she had imagined, and it had just broken a man's hand in front of her with the same calm he used to cut meatloaf. Carmine held out his right hand, for her to take so she could stand. A blood-stained hand. Faye looked at that hand. 3 seconds. Then she took it. Stood. Her knees flared with pain, but she could stand. Carmine led her to the escalade, opened the door, and she got in. Tommy handled the 2 men on the gravel, said something to the 2 men from the Suburban, then climbed into the driver's seat. The car moved. Silence. Long. Faye looked out the window, watched Richmond's streets pass by, and said, without looking at him, "You can kill people." Not a question. Carmine looked straight ahead. Yes. Silence. Then Faye spoke again, her voice lower. "You've killed people." Yes. A longer silence. Red light. The car stopped. Faye turned to look at him, and her eyes now weren't frightened eyes anymore, but eyes trying to understand, trying to find something in those cold gray eyes that she could hold on to, something that could explain why this man killed people, but also asked whether she had eaten, broke a man's hand, but also handed her a silk handkerchief to wipe off gravy. Then why did you save a waitress at a meatloaf diner? The light turned green. The car moved. Carmine didn't answer right away. The silence stretched over 2 blocks, long enough for Faye to think he wouldn't answer at all. Then he spoke, in a voice that made Tommy in the driver's seat force himself not to turn around, because he had never heard the boss speak in that voice before. Not the voice of a boss, but the voice of a 36-year-old man telling the truth for the first time in a very long time. Because you're the only person who ever fed me without asking for anything, and I'm trying to figure out why that matters to me so much. The car stopped in front of the house on Maple Street. Faye opened the door, stepped out, then stopped. 1 foot on the gravel, 1 foot still inside the car. She turned back to look at Carmine, and in her eyes at that moment was everything she had seen over the past 3 hours. The broken hand, the sound of bone, the blood on his knuckles, the calmness with which he had broken a man's hand, the same calmness he used when cutting meatloaf. And she said in a voice that didn't shake but wasn't steady either, the voice of someone telling the truth even when she knew the truth would hurt. "Your world is dangerous. I have no place in it, and I don't want one." Carmine looked at her, said nothing, didn't argue, didn't explain, because he knew she was right, and Carmine Valenti didn't waste words denying the truth. Faye stepped out, closed the door, climbed the stairs, and went inside. This time, the escalade didn't wait 14 seconds. Tommy drove away immediately. Carmine didn't tap the back of the driver's seat because he didn't need to give an order. Tommy had already understood from the look in the rearview mirror that the boss wanted to leave here, right now, quickly, before anything he was feeling had time to become something he had to admit. Carmine didn't come to Gus's diner anymore. Not Tuesday. Not Thursday. Not Saturday. The last booth stayed empty. No one ordered the meatloaf. The iced tea with extra lemon that Faye still made every night was poured out at the end of the shift because no one drank it. Gus looked at the empty last booth, looked at Faye pouring out the iced tea, and he didn't ask, because Gus never asked questions when the answer would hurt the person being asked. Carmine didn't call, didn't text, didn't send anyone, but the black Suburban still parked at the far end of the lot behind the diner every night Faye worked her shift, and the two men inside still sat there, their eyes sweeping the gravel lot, because Carmine had withdrawn from Faye Holloway's life, but he hadn't withdrawn his protection, because withdrawing protection meant leaving her alone in the dark, where Barbieri's men had touched her once, and Carmine Valenti didn't allow a second time, even if she wanted him gone. His shadow was still there. 2 weeks, 14 days of Faye going to work, visiting her father, crying for 2 minutes, tying on her apron, serving tables, pouring out iced tea at the end of the shift. 14 days in which she didn't say Carmine Valenti's name to anyone, not even Bess. And Bess didn't ask because Bess saw the empty last booth and understood that Faye had done what Bess told her to do, and now Bess wasn't sure whether it had been the right thing, because Faye looked more tired than before, tired in a different way, not tired from lack of sleep, but tired from the absence of something she had only just begun to have, and had cut away by her own hand. On the 10th day, the letter came. A white envelope, the Meadow Creek Nursing Home logo, postmarked Richmond. Faye opened it in the kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning before her bakery shift. She read it twice because the first time, she didn't trust her eyes. Meadow Creek Nursing Home announced that it would close its facility within 60 days because it was located within the eminent domain zone under the order of the Richmond County Court, part of a commercial redevelopment project in the Eastern District. Patients would need to be transferred to alternative facilities. A list of alternative facilities was attached, the nearest one 35 miles away, with care costs 40% higher. Faye set the letter down on the kitchen table, gripped the edge of the table with both hands, and breathed. Her father was going to be moved. The new nursing home cost almost half again as much. She already didn't have enough money to pay the old one. Desperate, Faye pawned the only keepsakes she possessed, her mother's silver necklace and her father's vintage Pentax camera. But combining those painful sacrifices with months of hard-earned tips only yielded a meager $752. The new facility required a 3-month deposit, $8,400. She was short by more than $7,000. On the 13th day, Faye sat on her bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, reading the nursing home's letter again, and her eyes stopped on the final line, the line she had read 10 times before but read differently this time. Pursuant to Eminent Domain Order Number 473. Signed by County Judge Preston Whitfield. Preston Whitfield. The man who had dumped a plate of meatloaf over her head. The man who had called her a pig. The man who had grabbed her apron. And now, the man who had signed the order, forcing her father out of the only place where he was cared for. He hadn't only humiliated her for one night. He was destroying her life from every side without her knowing it, piece by piece. And the biggest piece was her father. Faye set the letter down, stared at the ceiling, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she wasn't used to. Not sadness, not exhaustion, not resignation, but anger. Real anger. The kind that burned hot in the chest and cold in the head. The kind of anger she had always swallowed down. But this time it wouldn't go down. It stood in her throat and refused to go anywhere. Thursday. Night shift. Faye came to the diner, tied on her apron, put up her hair, and when the shift went quiet at 9 o'clock, she did something she had never done before. She walked to the last booth, Carmine's booth, sat down, and waited. The booth was empty. The iced tea no one had ordered sat untouched. She sat there for 10 minutes, looking at the Formica tabletop, looking at an old half-moon coffee stain someone had left behind, then stood and walked to the counter. Gus. Gus looked up from the glass he was polishing. Does he still come? She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. Gus knew who he meant. He set the glass down, looked at Faye with the eyes of a 65-year-old man who had seen enough of the world to know when someone was standing at a crossroads and every direction was hard. and he said slowly, "You told him to go, and he went. What do you want, Faye?" Faye didn't answer because she didn't know the answer. She went back to work, served tables, poured coffee, cleared plates. The night shift ended, 11 o'clock. She untied her apron, hung it on the hook, and stepped out the back door. Gravel lot. The Civic. And beside the Civic, the black Escalade. Engine off, lights off. Carmine stood leaning against the car door, black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, arms crossed over his chest, gray eyes watching her as she stepped into the light spilling from the kitchen door. He hadn't come inside the diner, hadn't sat in the booth, hadn't ordered meatloaf. He stood outside in the gravel lot and waited. Because 14 days without seeing her were 14 days he didn't want to repeat. And when Gus had called Tommy 2 hours earlier and said, the girl asked about him, Carmine hadn't needed to hear anything more. Faye stood 3 meters from him, looked at his hands, clean hands, no blood, only the platinum ring glinting under the moonlight. She breathed in, breathed out, then said in the voice she had been preparing for 2 days, though it still shook when it came out, "I need your help. My father is about to be forced out of his nursing home because of an eminent domain order. The person who signed it is Whitfield, the same Whitfield." She stopped, swallowed. "I want to know whether you can help my father without killing anyone." Carmine looked at her, looked at the brown eyes that had looked at him with fear 2 weeks earlier, and now looked at him with something else. Not trust, not yet, but something closer. Something like a decision, the decision of a person who had weighed every choice and realized the worst choice was still better than having no choice at all. He didn't answer right away. He opened the car door. "Get in. Tell me from the beginning." Frankie completed the file in 42 days. 42 days from the night, Faye had climbed into the Escalade in the gravel lot and told Carmine everything from the beginning, from the nursing home letter, from the eminent domain order, from the name Preston Whitfield on the final line. 42 days during which Frankie Ferraro, 63 years old, used every connection 2 generations of bosses had built and dug into the deepest layers of the system. Whitfield thought he had buried well. And what Frankie dug up was beautiful. Beautiful in the way evidence is always beautiful when the victim believes himself untouchable and doesn't bother hiding. Whitfield had been taking money from the Barbieri family for 12 years, routed through 3 shell companies, more than $2 million in total. He had signed 17 eminent domain orders for projects backed by Barbieri, each order clearing the way for a money laundering operation through commercial real estate. He had avoided taxes on personal assets for 9 years. He had harassed 4 court employees, 3 of whom resigned without anyone asking why. Carmine read the file in the second-floor study, read it slowly, page by page, number by number, surveillance photograph by surveillance photograph, wire transfer copy by wire transfer copy, and when he finished, he closed the file, placed both hands on the cover, and sat still for 3 minutes. He could kill Whitfield. 1 call, 1 night, 1 line in the next morning's newspaper that the police would never solve. Carmine had done this before, and he would do it again if necessary, and he wouldn't lose sleep over it. But in those 3 silent minutes, he heard Faye's voice. Not in the room, but in his head. Her voice that night in the car. Violence doesn't solve anything, and he heard her voice that night in the gravel lot, when she looked at his blood-stained hand and felt afraid. Not afraid of him, but afraid of the darkness inside him. And he remembered her saying, "I want to know whether you can help my father without killing anyone." That question, the kind of question that, if anyone else had asked Carmine, would have earned nothing but a cold smile. But she had asked it, and he hadn't smiled, because she wasn't asking for herself. She was asking for her father, and she was asking for him, for some part of him she still believed existed. He called Frankie. "Send the entire file to the FBI. Anonymous channel, no trace." Frankie was silent for 1 second, because in 23 years serving the Valenti family, he had never once heard the boss order evidence handed to the FBI. Never, because that went against every principle of omerta he lived and breathed. But Frankie didn't ask why. He said, "Understood, boss," and did it. 7 days later, the FBI Civil Rights Division received an anonymous file package with no fingerprints, no traceable source, only 320 pages of evidence arranged in such a clean chronological order that the agents looked at one another and knew this hadn't come from an amateur. That same week, 4 major Virginia newsrooms received copies of the eminent domain documents, along with a list of the affected households and businesses, including Meadow Creek Nursing Home, including the name Walt Holloway. Richmond Times-Dispatch ran the first story, then the Washington Post, then local stations, then national cable. Cody's video, which had more than 3 million views by then, was placed beside the corruption evidence until the picture became one no lawyer could untangle: a county judge pouring food over a waitress's head, the same county judge taking millions in bribes, the same county judge signing the order that would force that waitress's father out of his nursing home. The Federal Judicial Commission called a public hearing. Hearing room, Richmond Federal Building. Gus Petrakis took the stand first. The 65-year-old Greek man wore the only white shirt he owned, buttoned all the way to the neck, sat before the microphone, and told his story in an even, low voice that didn't shake, about 15 years of being threatened with eminent domain, 15 years of receiving letters from the county court, 15 years of knowing the diner he had built with $400 and 40 years of sweat could be flattened at any moment because one man needed his land for a project whose name Gus was never allowed to know. Earl Hobbs went next. 62-year-old veteran, old military jacket, unit badge on his chest, sitting before the panel and speaking in a voice that 2 tours in Iraq had never made shake, but that shook today. I was sitting in the diner that night. I saw him dump food on her head. I wanted to stand up. And I didn't stand. I sat there and did nothing for 19 minutes. I carry that fault. I came here today because I don't want to carry it one more day. Cody Marsh played the video from his laptop. 17 years old, his hands still shaking the way they had that night, but his voice steadier now, because he had 3 months to turn from the boy trembling behind the kitchen door into a witness sitting before a federal panel. The video played in the hearing room, and 12 panel members watched the screen. Watched the plate of meatloaf flip upside down. Watched the gravy run through Faye's hair. Heard, eat from the floor, pig, and the room went so silent they could hear the ceiling fan turning. Faye took the stand last. White blouse, hair tied neatly back, no makeup, no private attorney because she didn't have the money to hire one, only herself and the microphone and the truth. She told it, calmly, from the beginning, from the moment Whitfield walked into the diner, from the moment Warren drove the customers away, from the moment he said, "Don't they have appearance standards when they hire waitresses here?" From the moment he knocked over the beer, grabbed her apron, and the plate of meatloaf. The panel's attorney asked, "Miss Holloway, how did you feel when Mr. Whitfield dumped the plate of food over your head?" Faye went silent. 5 seconds. The hearing room waited. Then she spoke, her voice not shaking, but her eyes red. "I felt like my mother was watching me from somewhere and crying, because my mother taught me that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, no matter what they look like. And that night, Mr. Whitfield decided I didn't deserve that. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was fat." No one in the room said anything. One panel member lowered his face. The court clerk stopped typing. A reporter in the back row lowered his pen. Whitfield sat at the defendant's table, with no Warren beside him because Warren had long since vanished into North Carolina, with no one beside him, only himself and his gray suit and the hands he had placed on the table without knowing where else to put them. The result of the hearing came 4 weeks later: removal from office, permanent disbarment, referral to the Federal Department of Justice for prosecution on bribery and abuse of public power charges. The eminent domain order was suspended pending investigation. Meadow Creek Nursing Home didn't have to close. Walt Holloway didn't have to be moved anywhere at all. Outside the federal building, in the afternoon, the January sunlight was weak but warmer than it had been all week, and Faye walked down the stone steps, her white blouse wrinkled at the elbows because she had sat too long in a hard wooden chair, her eyes still red. Carmine stood at the foot of the stairs, black suit, hands at his sides, no Tommy, no bodyguards, only him. Faye walked over, stopped in front of him, and looked down at his hands. Clean hands. No blood. No bruising. Only the platinum ring, the wolf, the ruby eyes. She took his hand. The first time she had taken his hand by choice, not because he had offered it to pull her up from the gravel, but because she wanted to hold it. And his hand was warmer than she had imagined. Warmer than steel. Warmer than everything she knew about him. "You didn't kill him." "No." "Why?" Carmine looked at her, gray eyes looking into brown ones, and he spoke in a voice that would have made Frankie sit down if he had heard it. that would have made Tommy turn his face away if he had heard it. A voice Carmine Valenti hadn't used with anyone since his mother was alive. "Because you told me not to." 1 year later, the black Escalade pulled into the gravel lot of Gus's diner, and beside it, the 2007 Honda Civic was parked neatly between the two painted lines. Its paint old, but its engine smooth, the check engine light no longer blinking, the registration brand new. The Escalade door opened. Carmine stepped out, but today he looked different. No black suit, a navy shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, khaki pants, brown leather shoes instead of black, and on the ring finger of his left hand, beside the platinum ring with the ruby-eyed wolf he had worn for 8 years, there was another ring now. Silver, simple, unengraved, thin, the kind of ring someone buys at a small jewelry shop on a street corner, not from a place that sells rings for mafia bosses. And that ring was there because Faye Holloway had chosen it. Because she had said, "I don't need diamonds. I need you to wear something I chose." And Carmine Valenti, the man the entire East Coast feared, wore the $200 silver ring beside a platinum ring worth a fortune, and never took it off. The other door of the Civic opened. Faye stepped out, wearing a floral dress, white sneakers, her brown hair loose instead of pulled into a messy ponytail. Still chubby, still not a model, still not the kind of woman people would notice first in a crowd, but her eyes were different. No longer shadowed, no longer carrying the exhausted look she had worn for 4 straight years. Warm brown eyes that were now warm without pain. She took Carmine's hand. They walked into the diner. The bell above the door rang twice, exactly the same 2 rings it had made for decades. But the diner was different now. Fresh paint, a warm cream color instead of yellowing white, new tables and chairs, pale wood, solid and sturdy. But the stainless steel counter from 1958 was still there, shinier now because someone had polished it, and the neon sign outside still flickered twice, before glowing steadily because Gus said not to fix it. It had flickered since opening day, and it would flicker until closing day. On the wall behind the counter, the black and white photograph of Vittorio shaking Gus's hand still hung in its old place, but now 2 more photographs hung beside it. The first, Nina Valenti, black hair, wide smile, standing in a kitchen with flour on her apron, holding a wooden spoon, a photograph taken before she came to America, a photograph Carmine had found in one of his mother's old boxes and brought to the counter 6 months earlier, saying nothing, only setting it down, and Gus understood, took a nail, and hung it on the wall without asking a single question. The second, Walt Holloway, sitting in a wheelchair, half smiling in a faint, blurred way, and Faye standing behind him with one hand on her father's shoulder, a photograph taken at the new nursing home, a better facility than Meadow Creek, 15 minutes by car from Richmond, paid for by Faye with her salary as manager of the diner, the position Gus had handed over before retiring. Not with Carmine's money, because Faye still didn't accept his money, and he had stopped trying, because he understood now, understood that she didn't refuse out of pride, but because that was how she kept herself as herself. Gus Petrakis had retired 3 months earlier, 66 years old, 41 years behind the counter. But every morning he still came in, sat on the first stool at the counter, drank black coffee, and polished a glass that was already clean one more time, because Gus didn't know how to live without this diner, and the diner didn't know how to run without Gus sitting there. Walt Holloway. The new facility was better, the doctors were better, and one Sunday afternoon when Faye brought Carmine to visit, Walt was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, late afternoon sunlight passing through the thin curtains, and when Carmine stepped into the room, Walt looked at him, looked for a long time, longer than Walt had looked at anyone since the stroke 3 years earlier. His eyes stopped on Carmine's face, moved down to his shoulders, down to his hands, then back up to his face, and his lips moved, slowly, painfully, like a rusted machine trying to start again, and he said 2 words, his voice hoarse because his throat no longer remembered how to speak, but clear enough for the whole room to hear, the first sentence he had spoken after more than 2 years of silence. "Son-in-law." "Too tall," Faye cried. "Not for 2 minutes. Not until the hot water ran out," she cried, standing in the middle of the hospital room, both hands covering her mouth, shoulders shaking, and she cried because her father recognized her, recognized that she had someone beside her, recognized enough to make a joke, and that joke was the greatest gift she had ever received in her life. Carmine stepped beside the wheelchair, knelt down, and took Walt's hand. the calloused hand of a mechanic held in the hand of a mafia boss. And he didn't let go for 20 minutes, said nothing, only held it, because Carmine Valenti knew what it meant to lose a father, and he wouldn't let Faye lose hers again if he could stop it. Now, inside the diner, Faye and Carmine sat in the last booth. His booth, the booth where she had sat waiting for him that night after 14 days. She ordered 2 plates of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and 2 iced teas with extra lemon. She looked at him and smiled. He looked at her and didn't smile, because Carmine still rarely smiled. But his gray eyes no longer looked like frozen water in January. They looked like spring water, still cold, but beginning to thaw. Preston Whitfield was serving 9 years in Petersburg Federal Prison. Every day, in the cafeteria, he cleared food trays for other inmates. Aluminum trays, prison food, powdered mashed potatoes, molded ground meat, brown gravy from a packet. Every time the gravy stuck to his hands, he remembered the sound of the plate striking the girl's head, remembered the gravy running through her hair, remembered the 6 words he had said, and that remembering, the memory that never went out, never faded, never received forgiveness from any courtroom inside his own mind, was the second sentence. The sentence with no expiration date. Cody Marsh, 18 years old, had just received a journalism scholarship to the University of Virginia. His scholarship essay began with, "My grandmother told me, if you see something evil, make sure other people get to see it too. I saw it, and I pressed record." Earl Hobbs sat on the County Civilian Oversight Board, attended meetings every month, had reviewed 43 complaints of abuse of power in the first year, and had not stayed silent for a single one of them. Nina's Table, a nonprofit organization providing free meals for single mothers and struggling families, operated out of the back kitchen of Gus's diner every Sunday, named after Carmine's mother, funded with legal money from the real estate side of the business, that Carmine was slowly bringing into the light, the first step on a decades-long road he knew he might never finish, but had begun walking anyway, because Faye never told him to become a good man. She only told him not to kill anyone, and from there he had found the rest on his own. The meatloaf arrived, hot, mashed potatoes, green beans, thick brown gravy. Faye cut the first piece, put it into her mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed, and closed her eyes for 1 second. Carmine cut the second piece. 2 iced teas with extra lemon stood side by side on the Formica table, the ice slowly melting. On the wall, Nina smiled from the old photograph. Flour on her apron, wooden spoon in her hand, and if you looked closely, you would see that her smile looked like the smile Faye gave customers at 7 o'clock during the night shift. Warm, imperfect, leaning more to the left than the right, and needing no reason. The story of Faye Holloway and Carmine Valenti wasn't a fairy tale. No one was entirely good. No one was entirely bad. There was only a girl the world had taught to be invisible, but who refused to disappear, and a man the world had taught there was only violence, but who learned from a plate of meatloaf at 2 o'clock in the morning that there was something else. The lesson isn't that the strong save the weak. The lesson is that kindness doesn't need power in order to exist, but when kindness touches the right person, it can change even the things power can't change. Faye didn't soften Carmine with beauty, or money, or anything the world tells women they need to have. She softened him by being kind to a blood-soaked man at 2 o'clock in the morning without asking his name, by pushing back $5,000 because you were hungry and you were hurt, that's reason enough, by standing with gravy in her hair and saying, "I'm still standing here." She reminds us that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness, no matter what they look like, no matter who they are, no matter what the world has said about them. And if you're watching this video, if anyone has ever made you feel like you weren't worthy, not beautiful enough, not thin enough, not good enough, not enough of anything at all, then I want you to know that Faye Holloway felt that way every day too. And she still got up, tied on her apron, went to work, and was kind to the people around her. And that kindness changed a mafia boss, destroyed the career of a corrupt judge, and saved a nursing home from being flattened. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself somewhere in Faye, in Gus, in Earl, in Cody, if you've ever been the person no one noticed until you refused to stay silent, press like so we know this story reached the right person. Share this video with someone you love. Someone who needs to hear that kindness isn't weakness, but the bravest thing you can do every day. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories where ordinary people do extraordinary things, Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any videos. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever known a fae in your life? Someone kind even when no one was watching? Someone who kept smiling even when the world didn't smile back? Or are you fae? And are you tired? Tell us in the comments. We read every comment, and we want to listen to what is deepest in your heart, because sometimes writing it down is a way of healing, and this comment section is a safe place for you to do that. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.